taking a moment to get everything set up. We'll start in a minute or two. There's some material in the nest you might enjoy reading in the meantime. Okay, guys, I'll get started. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. If you're new here, what we do is we cover the news and we use lots of mainstream resources, but then we try to accent that heavily using open source information, open source analysis developed from great accounts here on Twitter. And in addition to that, we try to present tools and techniques so that whether you're new to open source analysis or you've been at it a while, hopefully you'll pick up some tips and we can all bring our skills up together. Finally, we try to pretty regularly have on guests who are doing great work in an area of research to come on and present their projects. In that way, we hope that if you're interested in their work, you can follow them and potentially even reach out to help them out. And in that way, we can build some collaboration. This space relies pretty heavily on the use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the window where links to individual tweets are placed. If you were to scroll all the way to the right-hand side, you'll see that first item in the nest is the invitation to tonight's space. If you were to click on it, it'll open up the thread, and then below it, you'll see that we have my agenda and essentially speaking notes. The reason I include all those sources is so that you don't have to take my word for what I tell you. Hopefully I have sources for everything I speak to. And that way it's also a starting point if you want to take some of these items away for further reading. If you do have a look at the agenda, if you look ahead, if something catches your interest and you develop some questions or comments, we'd invite you to join the conversation. You can do that by requesting the microphone using the button that's in the bottom left-hand corner of the window. And because we'd like to get as many people into the conversation as possible, please consider retweeting the space. And you can do that with the button in the bottom right-hand corner of the Spaces window. We have a couple of excellent guests tonight. We have AllSource returning to speak with us. And he suggested a few of his friends, Luis and Alahuaso. So we're going to have a great chat with them. I'm going to take 5 to 10 minutes to run through a couple of resources just so we let people show up to the room. And then we'll get into our interview with them. And we'll chat with our guests for about an hour. And I suspect that we're working to bring in guests who do open source work beyond the war in Ukraine. We've done that several times before. In this case, we're meeting our guests, some of our guests for the first time, and hopefully we'll have a great conversation and have them back on. And so a lot of this our conversation tonight will be about sort of getting to know the lay of the land when it comes to open source analysis with regard to cartels in Mexico. So running through some of the items that are up in the nest, once again, the first tweet on the right-hand side is the invitation to tonight's space. The second item from the right is the invitation to our next conversation, which will be Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. I try to hold these discussions every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern and every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern. The third item from the right, I should say, is the link to the YouTube channel where friends of ours are live streaming this discussion. And we would usually encourage you to participate here on Twitter because it's only on Twitter that you can actually engage in the conversation. But sorry about that. If you are driving or you're doing chores or the like, you might appreciate listening on YouTube. And if you ever miss a conversation, you'd like to go back and
Excuse me, Mr. Bond.
Up with it.
You need a quick reset. I'll tell everybody, the YouTube channel. So up on the right-hand side of the nest, which is the little tiny space up above our heads, if you scroll to the very top. The third one in is the YouTube stream. You can find pretty much all of our recordings there, which is super handy if you need to come back and find something else. Go ahead, Mr. Bond.
Thanks for that. And so the fourth item from the right is the invitation, or excuse me, the fourth item from the right is our community calendar. And if you were to click on that link at the top of the tweet, the team up link, it will open the calendar in your browser. And then if you want to look at individual items, when you click them, usually there will be a link to registration for upcoming events, or if the event's already occurred, often there will be a recording. It's a mix of some spaces that are hosted here on Twitter by friends of ours, along with some outside events from universities and think tanks. The calendar is building up. It had been slow toward the end of the summer, but now that we're moving into fall, we're getting a lot more events. If you see any events that you think would be interesting to the community, feel free to send them by DM to myself or to Jacoby, who is in the audience. I will just briefly mention a couple of the upcoming events. If you click on that link, you'll see these items. So there is a presentation being done by Foreign Policy Magazine on their Digital Frontlines reports, which is a set of about 10 articles that they released about a week ago that speaks to how to protect civilians and critical infrastructure from emerging defense tech and the idea of future hybrid wars where cyber elements will be much more prominent. And I think a lot of those lessons are drawn from the war in Ukraine. The articles did come out about a week ago. If we spoke about them in the space at that time, and if you do search for Digital Frontlines, you can find the articles. But their presentation on this is coming up in just a couple of days. There's also a talk coming up with Andrei Kostin, who is Ukraine's Prosecutor General. He'll be speaking with the Carnegie Russia Foundation on September 26th. So that will be, I think, next Monday. And you can sign up for that talk now. I know that he has a very engaging account here on Twitter. So I'm sure it will be an interesting interview. Also a reminder of the upcoming event, actually starting tomorrow, which is the SANS OSINT Summit, which has, a couple of dozen talks on all sorts of different topics, OSINT related. Often, at this point, it would be too late to sign up, but often they will record their video of almost all the sessions and post them online. So, for example, if you go to YouTube and type in SANS and OSINT, you can find their videos from the last two conferences, which is pretty cool. The last two items here, one is to note there's another conference on right now, which is being hosted by the Global Investigative Journalism Network. And again, lots of topics relevant to OSINT investigators. It partly came to my attention because Benjamin Strick of the Center for Information Resilience mentioned that he's doing a talk on how to conduct satellite imagery investigations at the conference. And while the events aren't live streamed, many of them are recorded and some of them will be published afterwards. So I know Ben said he'd be releasing a write-up of his presentation after the fact. So keep your eyes out for that. And then finally, in terms of upcoming events, there's another OSINT conference. There are lots of them, I guess, this time of year, called OSINT Live, that is also being held online, and it's free. and it's going to begin on October the 5th. And it came to my attention because Elliot Higgins will be speaking at it, talking about OSINT's role in modern conflict reporting. So lots of interesting upcoming events. If you have a look in the Nest, the third and fourth items from the left are the podcasts that have come out in the last few days. I won't speak to them all. I'll note that some regulars like the Russia Contingency, hosted by Michael Kaufman, newest episode came out. He's interviewing Jack Watling from the Royal United Services Institute, which I haven't had a chance to listen to because it only came out today, but that should be a fascinating chat. And there are other good podcasts and reports put out by The Economist, the Atlantic Council. Sean Penn put out his new documentary on Ukraine called Superpower. And there are also some new podcast episodes from Philip O'Brien from The Telegram, speaking with Christian Tribert of the New York Times, a visual investigation team about Ukraine's long-range drones. There's a podcast episode put out by North Korean News, breaking down analysis of the North Korea-Russia summit. And there was an interview with Julia Davis, who is a really well-known Russian disinformation researcher. So lots of variety in terms of podcasts there. Okay, so I don't want to take up too much of our time. I know our guests have limited availability, so I'd like to get into our discussion. So I'd like to thank AllSource very much for lining up our excellent guests, Luis and El Huaso. And for those of you who didn't have a chance to hear our interview with AllSource a couple of months ago, he is very interested in research into the activities of the cartels in Mexico and does a great job, probably one of the most prominent English language accounts covering those developments here on Twitter. And so AllSource, I would love it. First of all, thanks for joining us again. And I would love it if you would quickly introduce yourself and maybe give our audience a quick introduction to our two guests.
Hey, thanks, Michael. And thanks to you, Exit, and to the entire team that you guys do for this. I mean, this is a great avenue to discuss the importance of open source intelligence. And so a quick introduction for those who might not know who I am. Knows AllSource News, and I cover Mexican cartels. And I started covering it. I created my Twitter account on March of 2021 because I noticed kind of something that I was very passionate about in the OSINT world was that there was a severe lack of coverage in the English-speaking side of Mexican cartels. But if you looked at Mexican Twitter, it was very prevalent. And so I decided to kind of jump in and try to do that and try to be that bridge between, the Mexican side of excellent coverage and on the U.S. and more international in the East-speaking world to provide it. And what I noticed covering it is that Mexico and the cartel wars that are going on there right now is a seriously under-researched and very little focus in both U.S. academia, international media, et cetera, on a crisis and a conflict that should deserve a lot more attention. And so by creating my account, I was very fortunate to reach out and connect with a lot of people such as Luis and El Huaso. And so for those listeners, I do a lot of where I would consider myself in the OSINT side of the house, right, is I focus a lot on trying to monitor cartel social media, right? I have a ton of burner accounts throughout all social media platforms, independent outside of just Telegram, but also WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and my ability to just track as much as I can through my own research and identify these accounts and then, share the information that is there. And our two excellent guests that are excellent experts on this topic, Luis Chaparro, a great journalist who has amazing sources. I've actually had the pleasure of meeting him in person. And by the way, Luis, I owe you a beer, so we need to get on Signal to get back on that. And his ability to get sources and covering this for decades really provides him a very unique ability to provide insight in the senior Mexican government and the cartels. And El Guaso, somebody that I've actually known for a very long time, kind of like a buddy of mine in the English-speaking world in the cartel side, he's a reporter for a great news site called Borderland Beats that by and far, no doubt, I will say this, is the premier expert on cartel research out there. They do an amazing work, amazing research. And also personally has, I've seen him, connect the dots on what might seem disparate events, and through his research and analysis, tie it all together. And luckily, we have our own, Michael, this is something you talk upon a lot, is, how do we connect and try to share resources? Fortunately, we have our own cartel Twitter group that we coordinate. Another great one that I see in the listener side is Latam Obscuro, and all these researchers, reporters, analysts out there, and we just try to figure out what is going on in Mexico, share information, try to get through the smoke, try to get through the fog of war, and try to get the truth. And something that is very difficult to do, but we try our best, and hopefully in a space like this, we can enlighten a lot of people about the misconceptions that cartels have and how better to address these serious issues that I think gets very little attention.
Well, thanks for that great introduction. I was hoping to start with a bit of a... Okay.
Sorry, you just need a quick reset. I'm sure you'll be right back. In the nest, when we're done with them and we take them out of the nest, because otherwise we get glitches, oftentimes just like what Mr. Bond just saw, we share them to the Space Tweet, and you can find that down in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and you'll be able to find those resources if you want to go back and look at any of the things that the gents talk about for Mexico or anything else that we talked tonight.
Hopefully that's a little better. Am I coming through okay now?
Nope, you're not.
You know what, Michael? While you think that, if it's okay, I'll ask kind of the first question, if that's all right, while you reset that to get this conversation going. And I think it would be, it's very important. And Luis, I'd love your take on this. And so for those who might not know, the biggest breaking news that we got this week was Ovidio Guzman, El Chapo, the famous El Chapo. If anybody's watched Narco Mexico or has any basic knowledge of cartels, the former leader of the Sinaloa cartel's name was El Chapo. He was detained and then obviously extradited to the United States after multiple prison escapes. And in the Sinaloa cartel, there was a split, basically. One led by Mayo Zambada, which is the Mayo Zambada faction of the Sinaloa cartel. And then the other one is the Los Chapitos. Los Chapitos are led by the sons of El Chapo. And kind of one of the main figures, Ovidio Guzman, his alias is El Raton, or the mouse. He was recently extradited to the United States. And this is significant because Los Chapitos are, the United States government heavily accuses Los Chapitos for being very involved in the fentanyl trade into the United States and the enormous pain and suffering that has caused the American community. So, Luis, to you directly, what is the significance of Ovidio Guzman being extradited to the United States after his capture in January, after that bloody battle we saw in Sinaloa?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to thank all of you guys for inviting me to this space. I think this is probably the second time I'm in one of these spaces, and it's a great source of keeping up with all the stuff that's happening. And also, that was a great update on what is going on with the Sinaloa cartel and the factions and the Ovidio, one of the youngest sons of El Chapo Guzman. So what I honestly think is, it will have two effects primarily. One, inside the faction, the Guzman faction of the Sinaloa cartel, now led by Ivan Archibaldo Guzman, the oldest son of El Chapo and allegedly the leader of the Guzman family inside the Sinaloa cartel. And I think inside the cartel, for what I'm hearing and seeing, it is absolutely demoralizing. I think, first of all, it was demoralizing that he was actually arrested a second time, because the first time was basically botched by the same Sinaloa cartel henchmen. They literally turned upside down the whole town of Culiacan and surroundings. And the Mexican president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, decided that it was probably better to just let him go. Now, this second time, they managed to arrest him, put him into jail in less than 10 minutes. There was a huge firefight. I went a couple of hours after that happened. I guess a day after the arrest of Ovidio Guzman, I went to Jesus Maria, basically his small village. It's a small village in the outskirts of Culiacan, like 35 minutes out of Culiacan. And it was still pretty much a war zone. You could still see a lot of the vehicles thrown over, a lot of mayhem from the gunfight. I went inside Ovidio's house and found grenades that were still unexploded. So all that showed that even though Jesus Maria was a really small and quiet town, most of Ovidio's neighbors really loved him. They said that he paid for their medicines, for their, like whatever they needed, he was paying for that, even for some bills, for some water bills and stuff for some of them. He was paying part of that. So it was really interesting to see how that was working out in that little town. A lot of the people happy, living a pretty much peaceful life, and all of a sudden turning a whole town, upside down. And that was demoralizing for the cartel, because they thought that the Mexican government was not going to be able to capture Ovidio again and actually keep him. They actually did. That was demoralizing. The second thing is that even the attorneys of Ovidio Guzman and some sources on his family were really confident that Ovidio was not going to be extradited, at least not during this administration. They thought they had a tight hand within the Mexican government. So when he was extradited, that was a red flag, especially for Ivan Archibaldo, who allegedly, and per sources, he asked everybody to lay low, to stop singing narco corridos, these drug ballads about them, stop going to parties, not fighting the Mexican cartel, the Mexican government, like when they captured Ovidio. And so I think for the cartel, it sent a message that if the Mexican government wants and the U.S. government wants, they can go after any of those guys. Now, in terms of the influx of drugs, I think it will have zero to none effect. I mean, Ovidio Guzman has been in prison now for several months, and the number of fentanyl being seized at the border, it's at an all-time high. So there's still a lot of fentanyl getting across the border into the U.S. There's still a lot of cocaine, meth, and it doesn't seem to be stopping. There was rumors, probably on social media, that the Sinaloa cartel, that Ivan Archibaldo, Ovidio's brother, ordered a halt to the production of fentanyl. But I think that in reality, it only lasted like probably less than 2 weeks, and they started producing back again. So yeah, I don't think it's going to have any effect on the drugs trafficking side of things.
So with that, actually, because I think, Luis, you hit up at an important point, and I think this is something I'd love to just, Wasso, if you can kind of expand on it for a second, is the propaganda. Right, this emphasis of cartel propaganda, and Wesley, if you can kind of just provide kind of like a generic overview of what you've seen, because this is something that you and I have talked extensively about cartel propaganda, and by all means, please also the narco corridos. So for those who don't know, narco corridos are basically, it's like a Mexican banda song music. It's its own type of genre where they eulogize cartel figures and cartel bands. And it's actually, when you're tracking cartels on Instagram and you look at a video of a bunch of gunmen, one of the ways that you can identify them, which faction they belong to, is what music they attach, these narcocorridos. And that's how I'm able to say, okay, these guys are Los Chapitos, these guys are Mayo Zambada, these guys are Grupo Elite of CJNG, et cetera, because they all have it. And ironically, a lot of those guys who sing those types of songs, live in the United States and have American music producers. So with that kind of intro, can you provide some, an explanation on this very important aspect of cartel propaganda and how it might distort the reality of what these cartels actually are?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be talking here. I just want to thank the hosts and everyone who's tuned in. I really appreciate everyone taking the time to discuss this super important topic. So specifically about music, because that's a really fascinating little subset of narco propaganda. This has been a thing for decades, since maybe the 60s, 70s, probably even earlier. There's a long history of musicians kind of singing ballads about, Robin Hood-like figures in Mexican organized crime. The poor person who is able to, make something of himself, maybe even often through crime. This sort of story, this ballad goes back decades. And this hasn't changed. We see, modern artists like Peso Pluma, who is not exactly a corrido writer, but he, creates music that in some way can sort of venerate organized crime or the narco lifestyle. And, this is kind of an interesting conversation we're starting to see in Mexico right now, because on the one hand, this is, deeply, culturally embedded thing, the singing about these criminals or these Robin Hood figures. But also, I think a lot of people are starting to wake up to, whether or not this is really good for culture. We've seen the Mexican president start commenting that, he thinks that these sorts of music, they drive the youth towards drug usage and criminality. And while nothing has been done at the federal level to really kind of regulate this stuff, because it's a very thorny issue that touches on freedom of speech and our artistry, we're starting to see some cities start to really examine these things. For example, the city of Chihuahua in northern Mexico, they've recently banned public events which play corridos tumbados, which is like a similar type of music which they argue perpetuates violence against women and drug usage. And among those artists who are banned is Peso Pluma, like a wildly popular Mexican artist right now who kind of meshes, older ballad styles with trap and electronic, and who if I'm not mistaken, I think he was like one of the most played artists this summer.
He beat Bad Bunny on YouTube streaming. He had more.
That's quite a feat.
Yeah, that's quite a feat.
Yeah, so this whole this entanglement between the veneration of the narco lifestyle, it really is going to create kind of an interesting situation when you look at Mexican music. That's just to give a quick example from in recent days, that particular artist Peso Pluma, he has sung some and created some music about the Sinaloa cartel. He's also made music about the CJNG, who are generally considered to be something of their biggest rival in Mexico. But last week, the CJNG left a narco banner in the city of Tijuana, warning him that because of his loose tongue and how he has created music about their opponents, if he comes for if he came for his concert in October, that they would kill him. And there were several days of silence, and then I believe last night, Peso Pluma canceled his tour in the city and decided that it wasn't worth the risk. So we have a really interesting insight right there into how criminal groups themselves view these messages, this music, where apparently the CJNG believes it would be too damaging to their reputation, or that in some way these messaging through this music is so powerful that they would not want to allow it on their own turf. And meanwhile, the Mexican government hasn't really made any steps to seriously cut these things off.
Well, so I appreciate having done a roundtable there on some specific issues, and the story of the arrest and extradition of Guzman highlights the complexity of the issues that we're paying it. The cartel issues in Mexico, where there's the interaction between the political aspects, the drug aspects, the potential for violence and the fighting in Culiacan, the interactions with the United States. So there are a lot of different angles to this. So having heard that, Allsource and Luis and Alawaso all take slightly different angles of analysis. I was hoping to step back just a little bit and say, or ask each of you, I tend to think a lot about how we process information and how we choose to deal with the information. And so I would love to hear from you guys. If you have thoughts about, you get your information mainly from this pool of sources. You then process it, and then you process it so you can share it with, a particular audience in mind. And so I'd love to hear, what do you view as your sources? What do you view as your audience? And are you, for Luis, for example, as a journalist, may be more focused on presenting the news as it occurs, whereas Alawaso, being interested in propaganda, may be doing his analysis because he's hoping to influence people's understanding of it or political outcomes. I'm not presuming any of those things, but I would love to quickly go around just to hear your guys' thoughts on how do you collect your information, and then who are you aiming your analysis at, and how that goes to your motivation for why you engage in this way. So maybe we'll just go around. Allsource, would you be willing to start?
Yeah. So, and that's a great point. And so, I've always said that I don't want people to view my account, and I kind of have an issue when people refer to me as kind of like. I don't view myself as somebody who's competing against journalists. Quite on the contrary, at all, and not at all. I coordinate with extensive amount of journalists and researchers on cartel activity. And so how I try to do, and my main focus is I take what I think people are very familiar with when we're talking about kind of open source intelligence, like other open source intelligence accounts that cover issues around the world. And I just do very much a very hyper focus, mostly on Mexican cartels with other issues. And so my whole intent is to provide content that is widely available across social media and messaging apps such as Telegram and WhatsApp, and then to publicly present that to anybody out there that then might find a story or require that information to then go more in depth in research and analysis, right? And then in avenues such as Spaces, or maybe if we have a time, maybe once or twice in a very long time, I then might write an article about, okay, this is kind of what the situation is going on, or in Spaces like this one, Michael, where, okay, we can go more into detail. But the main focus of mine is just to try to present information about Mexican cartels that they distribute between themselves to the wider audience. And I think there's a misconception of cartels, of this idea that they're the very secret organization, that they don't want people to know who they are or what they do. And that's not the truth at all. I mean, cartel members are very active, very vocal. They are not afraid. And then not only that, they have no problem sharing content of their activities in the United States. And I think the problem is that because maybe people are not looking at these specific accounts or these specific group chats, or et cetera, that kind of gets lost. And so what I do is to publicize that. And then through, like let's say Alawaso, and I'll let him expand, he might reach out to me and say, hey, I'm writing a research paper on a specific topic. I believe recently Alawaso was talking about narco messages. If I'm not mistaken, it was Guanajuato, a Mexican state. Hey, a lot of the things that you share, I've been very helpful to make sure that I can cover everything extensively. And then Luis, as a journalist, he has a phenomenal sources. The material that I had there, maybe he needs a video footage of a specific fighting. Maybe he needs a specific narco message photo. And instead of trying to, maybe, and not only him, but this happened with many journalists, they just reach out to me. It's like, hey, can I use something that you found and shared and posted as part of my news article? And that's the angle that I generally take with my Twitter. So although it's for everybody, I think the biggest bang for my buck is when I actually am dealing with researchers and journalists to provide a more full picture, because they can provide a lot of the context that I just simply don't have the time to do.
Well, that's great, and we've heard your story before and appreciate all that. And I know, Luis, you had mentioned that in contrast, you're on the ground. You talked about going into Guzman's home, right, and seeing weapons there. And I know that you also have a website to distribute your writing, which is lchaparro.com, which is in Luis's bio, by the way. So I'm wondering, Luis, how do you conceive of this idea of, do you focus on any pool for collecting information? And then what's your goal in publicizing it? Because clearly you've chosen to go the independent journalist route.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great help. All of these community of OSINT, because I'm probably more old school. I mean, when I'm out there, I'm still writing on paper with a pen, and probably not so much on my phone. Although I use my phone to share images or to capture audio or some stuff like that, but I'm still kind of like more old school. And by saying that, I mean a lot of the stuff hits first social media or platforms that are basically open source. And this is something that I've noticed that it's happening more and more probably the last 5 years, specifically with criminal organizations, with Mexican drug cartels. What I try to do is to have, it's probably slower than diving in and reporting something immediately. What I try to do is to take a slower approach and probably just like when Ovidio was arrested for the second time, I started getting a lot of messages on Twitter and then seeing reports from several of these accounts that some of us follow that have been very vocal and very openly sharing stuff about the Sinaloa cartel. They started talking about something happening in Culiacan and in the outskirts of Culiacan. I kind of like dismissed that because I thought it was just another infighting or something like that. But as soon as someone said that it was happening in Jesus Maria, this is a town that, going back again to the narco corrido, the drug ballads, we've heard a lot talking about how Ovidio Guzman is from Jesus Maria and he was living there and he has this house there. When I read online on Twitter, specifically on one of these groups that I follow, that they specifically talked about Jesus Maria, I was pretty much sure that something was happening and that probably they were after Ovidio Guzman. This happened, I think it was a Saturday, at around 6 in the morning, the first reports I started looking at, and then I try to mix both. So after getting a lot of those messages and seeing online on some of these groups posting stuff about the gunfight in Jesus Maria, I do have a lot of, or probably not a lot of, but good sourcing inside the Sinaloa cartel. So I reached out to some of them to ask them what are they hearing and what's happening. And 2 of them confirmed that Ovidio Guzman was arrested. I also have another couple of good sources inside the Mexican Sedena, the Mexican army, which I reached out to, and they told me they did have an operation in Jesus Maria, although they couldn't say if it was against Ovidio Guzman, and to me that was enough confirmation to know that something was happening and not risking myself just to publish or retweet something that could probably not be true. So yeah, it's usually I do that. Other times what I do is the other way around. If I get something from a source inside one of these criminal organizations, probably more on the Cartel Jalisco, because they're huge on propaganda, like they're huge trying to put out stuff there, and they often reach out to share stuff with me, probably knowing that me as a journalist, I'm going to try to publish, and that's going to help their propaganda or whatever. And usually what I try to do is to reach out to some of our friends here at these this space, like the guys from Borderland or All Source, and ask if they've seen this video before, if they know if they know any origin of that video or of that photo or of that image. And it's been very, very helpful, because probably before having a community of OSINT, I think you will just rely on what your source is telling you, that this photo is recent and that this photo is real and stuff. And sometimes it is not. Some other times, like just recently, I got leaked the latest photo of Ovidio Guzman right before he entered his first court hearing in Chicago, and I know that came out from a very good source in the U.S. Marshals in the U.S. And he just took a photo of a video and of in the screen and sent it out to me. I asked if the photo was real, if the photo was his, if it was manipulated in any way. And after getting a lot of those answers, I decided to publish it as an exclusive photo. And it did a good round in the Mexican outlets. So I think it is for us, for me at least, as journalists covering criminal organizations that are more and more trying to put out propaganda, it is really helpful to go back and forth people that are very knowledgeable on how to spot if something was already out there, if something is not from the place they say it is, or even like I'm very ignorant in when it comes to weapons. So a lot of these people are very, very knowledgeable about weapons, and that's been very helpful as well to identify what kind of weapons they're using. What could be even the source of that? Because we tend to say everything comes from the U.S., but turns out not all of it comes from the U.S., and that's been very, very helpful on my work as a journalist.
It's fascinating the impact that just networking has, not even just social media, but the ability to reach out to people all around the world who have the same particular interest. And so turning to El Huaso, it seems like, given your interest in propaganda and analysis of it, that you might have more of a purpose, whereas sharing the news is obviously important in the way that All Source and Luis do. By analyzing the propaganda, is it because you're hoping to counter it, or is it because you're hoping, to educate the public so that they can make more informed choices about, how to interact in the environment where the cartel is? How do you envision your process and your audience?
That's a good question. I have a pretty simple, motivation for doing this. I think that we often, when we think about organized crime in Mexico, we think of, cartels who are only armed, with AK-47s, AR-15s, maybe RPGs, some sort of guns stolen off of bases. And all of that is true. But that sort of lens of looking at organized crime in Mexico completely ignores the immense amount of effort that they put into building a narrative, into creating propaganda, into trying to really monopolize what we think and what we say about organized crime in Mexico. And I don't think that we can really fully combat organized crime in Mexico without really confronting this immense onslaught of propaganda that they release every year. As All Source said, I mean, we have this idea of organized crime or gangsters as being some sort of, masked men who, they operate at night in the shadows. They try and avoid government attention. But that model completely breaks apart when we look at the Mexican situation. These criminal groups, I mean, they started messaging sometime around 2006. There's a couple messages before that. But starting in 2006, every year, the number of narco messages doubled. It just spread across the entire country until like every single year you find like 300 different unique criminal groups who leave messages. And I think that, again, if we think only in terms of the physical dimension of conflict, and we forget the second dimension, which is the war of words, the war of ideas, of weapons, and of rhetoric perception, that we can't really understand the totality of security in Latin America. So my goal is simple. It's just that we need to really focus on what the criminal groups are focusing on. They release something like 1,500 pieces of propaganda every year, more or less 1,400 physical narco messages, and then there's dozens of scripted press conference style videos. They release death videos, torture videos. They use body messaging. they're putting a lot of effort into it. We need to understand why they're doing it, how it's affecting our perception of the war. And once in order to do that, in order to fight our enemy, we first need to name our enemy and realize what they're doing to us.
And so going from that general question, maybe we could get into some more specifics that can highlight the ways that you each do your investigations and do your reports. So we had asked you to give us a couple of examples of subjects that you thought were interesting. So I'd suggest maybe we just go around again, and if each of you would like to pick one or two of either the items you gave us or some subject that you're investigating now that you think is really interesting, you'd like to explain to us, in a couple of minutes. Maybe we can get into some examples, a little more detail. And so I had put the material that our guests had provided us up in the nest. So El Huasos are the first 4 items up there, and then the next 4 are the items that Louise shared with me. So I know that Louise is most limited on time, so maybe we'll go to you first. I see you shared the story of the murder of Mr. Hipólito in June as one example, and then you shared more information on Guzman and his extradition. So what investigation, either recently or ongoing, would you like to explain to us in a little more detail?
Absolutely. I think one of the most clear examples is I think both, to be honest. I mean, the first reports about someone killing or making an attack against Hipólito, who was this leader and founder of one of the first self-defense groups in Mexico, based out of Michoacan. Started coming out also on Twitter. This is the other importance of social media and other networks, is that when people start seeing something that it's not right, like let's say an attack against a community, it's against a town or against someone, they first go either to Twitter, Facebook. Probably those two are the main ones. Before they will reach out directly to one of the journalists that they probably thought had more audience. A lot of TV outlets, a lot of Mexican TV hosts. But right now, what they do is they usually go first and start putting, like live videos or images, or sharing out all that sort of things. And at first, I had to know if that was true, that if that was actually happening as they were popping up on social. Second of all, Michoacan in particular and the self-defense groups are very complex. They're very complicated to report on, because you can easily fall on their propaganda. Like it has happened before, that the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación has played out as self-defense groups, when in fact is henchmen from the cartel fighting another faction, or using people or using the name as a self-defense and stuff, and the other way around as well. Sometimes it is actually the people and self-defense groups that are putting out some action, and they've been called out as cartel. So this was a very, very complex and complicated story to report on online, to rely on what was happening there. So I first gathered the most I could from what was happening, and a lot of that was but helped by all sources, by El Huaso, by Borderland Beat, and by Lata Oscuro, and all of these guys that are here on this space. They started posting a lot of stuff and trying to fact check if that was happening, where that was coming from and stuff. So I started gathering a bunch of that info to try to make a route, a plan, and to see if it was worthy to get myself, I was going to say my ass, down to Michoacan. So after gathering most of that information, I thought it was probably a good idea to go down to Michoacán, to La Ruana, and to report there, talk to locals, talk to some of those self-defense groups, talk to also some of the cartels. I managed to speak with some of the Viagras and some of the leadership on the Caballeros Templarios. So I think that's literally how I gather information specifically for that story. I first start to putting out, to gather what is out there and what I could get, because there's a lot of times also where I don't think it's necessary. The story is developing so quickly and it dies so quickly and it is so clear. It is absolutely simple to know the whole story, that it's probably not worthy to just go out there and report a gunfight, an example. But in such complex developments like the self-defense groups and Michoacán and Guerrero and the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, I think it is important to get the help of a network, gather info online, and then go there on the ground to talk to sources and to try to make something clear for an English-speaking audience, which is also another huge challenge to explain, because mostly Mexicans, we have a lot of context already on what's happening, but a lot of U.S. Speaking audience, they don't have context. So it's hard not to oversimplify what is happening on one of these fights, and to actually explain what is really going on.
Absolutely. Exit, looks like you have a question. Go ahead.
So that particular murder of Mora, I think I'm going to pronounce everything wrong today, so I'm just going to say sorry up front for that. But is there context with that particular murder that the rest of English-speaking North America really just doesn't get about how important that murder was and how it affected the ability of cartels to operate generally in Mexico? Luis, that was sorry for you. I should have said that.
My bad. Yeah, I didn't know if it was for me or what. Yeah, exactly. The Hipólito's murder was I think it was widely covered, but it was again like a bit oversimplified on most of the U.S. media. I guess it was depicted as good versus bad. And it was depicted as, like the self-defense were the good guys, and then the bad guys, cartels, just killed one of the former leaders. But then again, like trying to make sense of all of that and how also some of the self-defense groups eventually became their own cartel, like Los Viagras. They literally began as part of the self-defense groups, and then they started taking what they called the I don't know what the right word in English to say this, but los perdonados. I don't think pardon. It's the.
I think they refer to them as the forgiven.
The forgiven. Yeah, exactly. I think that's the right word. So what the forgiven were is they were cartel members, mostly from the Caballeros Templarios, that literally said, okay, we're sorry that we are cartel. We don't want to be cartel anymore. We want to be self-defense. So the government allowed them to carry heavy weapons registered by the Mexican government and wear basically the shirt or the badge of a self-defense group. Of course, that turned out really bad, and I think that's also why Hipólito left the self-defense movement to keep just being like a solo vigilante in Michoacán. So his killing was pretty much important because it was selling a clear message that every single activist or social fighter in Latin America is a target, and probably most importantly is being left out alone by our governments, by the Mexican government in Mexico specifically. They never fully supported or took good care of Hipólito, and now it's kind of happening sort of like the same thing with his brother Guadalupe Mora, who has had several murder attempts. So most all of these really complex stories require a lot of context, require a lot of words, require a lot of different stories entangled into the same one. And, you know, us as journalists probably working for an established media organization, we have a word limit, which kind of sucks, to be honest, because then you end up with a 1,000 words article, which just partially explains what is happening, and there is not a chance to write a follow-up article or probably a series of 2 to 3 articles, and back again. I think this is why also these kind of like spaces and these kind of networks are very helpful, because then you can put together a wider narrative with more grayscales than just a black and white story.
And so just to highlight once again for the audience, if you want to read more about the murder of Mr. Hipólito, if you have a look, it's the 5th item in the nest. It's the tweet from Luis, and he passed along the story as written up by Vice. And so if you want to get more into the detail there, Vice's article was fairly long and seemed like it had more detail than a lot of mainstream coverage would have. And so I do want to turn to El Huaso and to Allsource just to get their thoughts on some item that they're particularly interested in at the moment. But I know Luis had told us he only had an hour. And so before turning to our other guests, I'll just say to Luis, thank you very much for joining us. Feel free to hang out as long as you're able. And if you have to go, then, again, I intended this mainly as an introduction to the broader group doing OSINT in this space. And we can only scratch the surface in the time available today. But if you have stories that you think are particularly interesting, or you want to, make a call for maybe some assistance down the road, reach out to us, and we'd love to have you come back on.
Absolutely. I really, really appreciate the opportunity of being on this space. And yeah, unfortunately, I'm always running, and I'm always late for something. So I'm going to have to run in probably some 3-5 minutes. But it was really a pleasure, and I hope that my intervention was of any help, any interest.
It was incredibly interesting. So thank you again. So El Huaso, are there any of the items that you provided to us, some of the articles that you provided were, fairly lengthy and very interesting. I found the one about the article in Small Wars Journal, which is the 2nd item in the nest, about sort of the propaganda fight where the cartels, some of them are directly opposing the government narrative. Not pinning you to that one, but are there any stories you're following now or that are particularly interesting you'd like to highlight to us?
The CG&G one, about opposition to the government. That's a fascinating one. We could definitely start with that. I can give you a little sneak peek of an article that I'm writing under my real name, which hopefully should be out within the next year or so. In this article, I've been tracing CG&G narco videos since their inception, since the beginning. When there was a murky connection between CG&G and the Matacetas, which were a group that sort of masqueraded as a vigilante or an autodefensa almost, created with the sole reason of destroying Los Zetas. And what's interesting is as how time went on, from the beginning, CG&G's first communications at that time, half using the Matacetas name, sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. They almost sound like a nationalist, like workers or people's group. That there's repeated mention that they're just good Mexicans. First we're vigilantes, then we're Mexicans. We're fighting for the peace of Mexico, for the good, honest, working man. Just based off of their rhetoric, you wouldn't assume that then 10 years later, their messaging would do a complete 180. And you can pretty much trace, as they've grown more powerful over the years, I argue that I think that their messaging has they no longer feel like they need to, kiss up to the government and, in their messaging try and seem as if they're not a threat. And we get to the point where we are now in the 2020s, and CGNG, they'll try and, as they did several years ago in Mexico City, they tried to assassinate the Mexico City police chief in one of the safest neighborhoods in all of Mexico. They contract some, they released these professionally touched up and photographs of some of their members on the middle of a road, posing with the CGNG letters and holding weaponry. The leader of CGNG, Mencho, they released a video for his birthday with a convoy with around 100 men in the middle of Jalisco and maybe 20 vehicles, many of them armored. So the mask is off. They're no longer pretending to be a sort of group that is not in competition with the government. That article, the Small Wars Journal article, I recommend y'all read it. It's in English, and it does a really interesting analysis of their messaging. And it just shows you, as these criminal groups, they grow more powerful, they don't really need the propaganda anymore as much, or their propaganda takes a different tone. It's no longer about, as their group power changes, their interest changes, they're happy to shed, whatever sort of rhetoric they've been using to justify their actions up until that point.
And if I may, actually, because I think this is something that's very important when we're talking. Specifically, I'm just going to focus a little bit on CGNG mostly, because kind of one of the problems that when we're covering cartels, and I see it here on Twitter, and the issue is that what CGNG does very effectively, I think it also hits it up, is kind of this militarized force. Right? They try to portray this image as that there's this elite group of sicarios. They manage, you have this aurora. We've all heard of how the Zeta cartels were formed by former Mexican special forces. And so they carry that mantra to make it appear as CGNG in its entirety is this elite kind of cartel group that obviously, when we look at movies and video games, etc., makes this image of cartels as this elite fighting force, and that's what CGNG does very well, effectively in propaganda videos, and they release it for mass consumption so that people kind of eat it up and be like, "Wow, look at this elite fighting force in Mexico." And that's farther from the truth. I mean, that is purely propaganda. That is maybe 1%. But if you look, let's look specifically CGNG. They have two specific, one of the names, they have two names, right, that really hone in this idea that there's the elite force. One of the factions is called Menchos. Mencho is the leader of CGNG. That's his nickname. It's Mencho Special Forces, Fuerzas Especiales en Mencho, right? So Mencho Special Forces. And the other one is Grupo Elite, or the elite group, right? And here's another one that they use, kind of that might be kind of pulling in from the U.S. Delta, right? That kind of sounds like Delta Force. That's what people would think, and that's what CGNG does very well. But when we're talking about cartels, that's not the truth. The vast majority of these are poorly trained. And they have very good equipment, and they might get it from the United States, they're not very effective at utilizing it. And 9 times out of 10, when they have engagements with the Mexican army, I've had experience dealing with the Mexican army. I've talked to them in a previous, career, and discussing with them, what it's almost like is like, yes, maybe a lot of times the Mexican cartels might outgun the Mexican army, but the Mexican army more than is capable of handling them because of superior training. Because the Mexican military is a professionalized force that has been doing this type of kind of almost like a counterinsurgency-esque fight since 2006. And when you're analyzing cartels, though, even the name cartel is kind of misleading, because although yes, they have leaders, right? So let's say CGNG is in Mencho, and look at the Sinaloa cartel now, since El Chapo was arrested, who was the undisputed leader. Now you have Mayo Zambada and then Los Chapitos as Luis eloquently laid out all the siblings. What really matters there are the factions, right? It's the factions and the families that kind of are the bedrock and the foundation of all these cartels and how they operate and utilize. And that is a huge component of how these cartels operate. Exit, I saw you shot your head up. Please go ahead.
Well, so just to the fear and the perception that they are putting out there, one of the things that I note, because it's something that we see in Ukraine pretty often, is things like specific weapons showing up in Mexico, drone strikes, which there's a post up there from El Waso about that. What are some of the, like, it's propaganda with words, but there's propaganda with actions as well that maybe they're using to create that same environment of fear. And I wondered if, also, if you could kind of expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that's a fantastic point. That propaganda is not just words. There's various different ways it can kind of manifest. And I'd like to go back to the example I brought up from the CGNG attempted assassination on Omar Garcia Harfuch, who is he's the police chief of Mexico City. This is, a massive metro area, 20 million people. I believe if it's not the largest police force in the world in Mexico City, it's absolutely the biggest one in the Americas. And this is a perfect example of making a statement without even having to speak. They attacked him they ambushed him with something like 24 men who were hiding in the back of a large, a truck with, wood inside so no one could see inside. They opened fire on him as he was leaving his home, again, right on Reforma, as he was entering Reforma, in one of the best, safest neighborhoods of Mexico City, the place where all the ambassadors live, all the CEOs live, government functionaries, evidently. So right here is just a perfect example of what CGNG, how they message without messaging. By striking right in the heart of Mexico City, in one of the safest areas, they're communicating that they're not afraid of the government. They don't care about any sort of, counterattack the government can do. They're telling him that we can kill one of the, the most popular government functionaries, one of the most powerful ones, right in his home, right in the safest part of Mexico City, in the president's backyard.
I hadn't turned my mind to the competition in the propaganda space before preparing for our conversations. And what I liked about some of the coverage that you do, El Waso, is that it shows how many factors there are pushing the propaganda window for the cartel groups, in that if the government takes a different approach and they go from being aggressive towards the cartels toward trying to minimize the perception of violence and say, no, the country is run in an orderly way, then that changes the incentive for the cartels to adapt their messages. And I imagine in the same way, the cartels compete among one another in the information space to occupy area. And I also like the detail in that article where it talked about how, in fact, having developed a little bit of propaganda expertise, some of the cartels are now actually selling that propaganda expertise to political candidates who want them to message in a particular way, one way or the other, that then support the opportunity for the politicians to cast themselves, either as a good leader by having resolved the problem, or as in opposition to, the strong leaders. So there was a lot of dynamics at play there that I hadn't considered before this. And just perhaps quickly, you mentioned that you might preview an article you're working on that might come out in the next while. Could you give us just a moment of shedding light on what that will be about?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and this would be under my real name. In my real life, I'm not just a blogger full time. I'm in the think tank kind of space, more focusing on data research related to security in Mexico. And in this project, I'm looking at CGNG messaging over time, and I'm trying to find every single press conference style narco video they've released, and I'm creating transcripts of every single one, and I'm trying to identify their key themes, how they message, what are the kind of things they like to hit on, what are their stock phrases, because that's something that they really use. And what I'm finding as I'm working on this project is that if we dismiss, messaging of organized crime as just, crude messages to guys who are just simply trying to threaten, and that there's nothing beyond that, we totally miss the point when we misunderstand, their ability to message. And another thing I'm really interested in finding is exactly what AllSource mentioned about, different cells meaning different things. You'll find that certain groups, certain cells who use this operate under the CGNG banner, but regional factions, some of them message far more effectively and far more profusely than others. The Grupo Elite cell, which is the CGNG's spearhead into central Mexico, I think they're probably doing the most professional, the most well thought out strategic messaging right now. They make frequent use of stock phrases. They use kind of reactive messages to, when a rival group does something particularly heinous, or even if they do something heinous, they'll immediately release a bombardment of messages in a region blaming them for that. And they'll even use language like, we denounce the cowardly attack by our rivals. We, the CGNG, are drug traffickers with principles, and that's a quote. Unfortunately, I can't tell you a whole lot more, but I'd be happy to, update you as the project comes out.
Well, that would be terrific. AllSource, go ahead.
No, and I think this is and this is where it's important, like the devil's in the detail. And I think, also brought up, just stock phrases, right? Like a typical one of CGNG is puro cuatro letras, right? Pure 4 letters. The 4 letters are the acronyms of CGNG, right? It's fascinating, these cartels have their own Instagram accounts, right? There's one specific, like the Grupo Flecha. So the Grupo Flecha is one of the Mayo Zambada factions of the Sinaloa cartel, very active in Zacatecas and an intense fighting against CGNG in Zacatecas. And they upload a lot of material on their Instagram account, similar to that kind of that propaganda. And also, like the narco messages that we see, you can tell the quality and how much. Some of them are crude, very misspelled. They just write it on a blank white paper, and other ones look like almost like a campaign rally banner that you would see in a U.S. election, right? And then it goes up there. We've seen reports of them flying, just civilian airplanes like a Cessna, and then dropping pamphlets, almost like the U.S. Army would have done PSYOPs in Afghanistan. And more importantly, though, I think we focus a lot on the big names, right? The Sinaloa cartel and CGNG. Those are the 2 largest cartels in Mexico with international reach. I think the DEA estimates they're operating in over 40 countries, tens of thousands of operatives, and international drug trafficking reach across the world. But we cannot ignore these smaller cartels that even in the drug trade are almost minuscule and almost insignificant, but are drive a lot of the violence that we see, right? So one of them in Guasco I've talked a lot extensively is the Cartel de Santa Rosa de Lima, the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel in Guanajuato, which 2 years ago looked like they were going to be dead, like they were going to be defunct and no longer functioning. They kind of got this birth back to life. And actually, they are and what they lack in probably the reach of CGNG, they make up with violence, right? So a lot of the mass shootings that we see in Guanajuato against bars and restaurants that cause like 8, 10, 12 killed, what we see is the Santa Rosa Lima cartel has zero qualms or issues of recording the mass shooting while it happens. And then they have a standard, typical way that they left a narco message. It's a small orange pamphlet, like an orange paper that you can buy like in a Office Depot. And then they write their message there, and they have their symbol, which is a triangle with a hammer. With like 2 hammers overcrossing the triangle, and they will record themselves doing this violence and then drop it, right? And so there's a component of hearts and minds that CGNG does very well in Michoacan, right? And it almost to the point where a lot of the rural communities, it looks like CGNG is actually getting rural communities in Michoacan to support them, because they manage to the messaging they do in Michoacan is very geared towards, look at this predatory state that is supporting our rivals. rivals. Look at the Mexican government supporting the rivals, Carteles Unidos specifically, and how they are targeting, farmers and agricultural products and trying to, beef up prices and make sure that you can't produce because they want elevated prices to smuggle those goods across, to the United States, et cetera. And another, but that's one. But another one that I think, and we've also discussed this, and I think this is also very important, is just the violence, right? And I think one cartel that does a very good job of just pure horror and terror and violence is the Cartel del Noreste, the Northeast Cartel. Their acronyms are CDN, and they're kind of like the successor of the Zeta cartels, to the point where a lot of people will say CDN Zeta cartel because they kind of succeeded, and they're based out of Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, which is across the border from Laredo, Tamaulipas. And CDN is very apt of they kind of do the traditional, and this is widespread across, but specifically CDN of the dismembered bodies, and leaving them in coolers with a message saying, this is who we are. A specific group, a specific faction of CDN is called Operativo Texas, right? The Texas operative. And the Texas operative, just this year, almost got notoriety because they released extremely horrific execution videos where, just briefly, they grabbed a rival and surgically and medically, while the person was alive, managed to peel his face off, opened his throat, removed his tongue, opened his chest, removed the heart, and then show in the camera while the heart was still beating. And it almost reminisced, and I believe also we had this conversation, it almost reminisced of the kind of this jihadi John of ISIS, right? When we see these gruesome ISIS execution videos and what they do, we see this, but before what we see in a lot of the cartel execution videos, it's just brute violence. Here's an axe, here's a machete, I'm just going to cut you up. But the way that the Operativo Texas operates, it's different. It's even more horrifying with the precision surgical methods that they use, and the intent of that is to instill fear not only against their rivals but the populations, to send a message.
Please go ahead, Waso.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, and yeah, that's the Operativo Texas. That's really it seemed almost like we were returning back to the Zetas days, who were the first criminal group who really kind of, I think it's fair to say they're responsible for the state of brutality that we see, in Mexico today. And that's, again, that's something that, we really need to be kind of looking at and trying to understand, like, why engage in such extreme violence like that. It doesn't make sense if your goal is about, moving drugs north. There has to be some sort of reason that they're engaging in such violence. A really interesting book that I recommend y'all pick up is A Sense of Brutality by the philosopher Carlos Alberto Sanchez. He has a lot of really interesting ideas trying to explain like why that happens. So like why these criminal groups try and just insert this brutality into our eyes and make us watch it. And I don't know, my personal view, and I don't really way to test this, but I wonder if it's just to kind of normalize it, just create a sort of, societal just acceptance of what's happening. You'll notice sometimes that, Mexico, the violence is so extreme, but people don't vote like it is. It's not few people like really are out in the streets for this kind of violence. And when you compare this to other countries in Latin America, like say Chile, where violence or homicide rate upticked by 1 point in a year, and instantly overnight, 75% of the country voted in a national poll that violence and crime was the number one issue facing the country. We don't see that in Mexico. And I have to assume part of it is because criminal groups have done their job by inserting this violence into the common psyche for 20 years, and that we're at the point right now where people just accept it. It's just daily life.
That idea of having to ramp up the amplitude of your message just to break through the noise is one thing. Exit asked a question earlier about, there's messaging or propaganda in words and messaging and propaganda in deeds. I also imagine that sometimes those things might not be aligned well, or that people, while the propaganda at the high end is increasing in sophistication, that in order to maintain a consistent message across the group, particularly with a sophisticated program, would be a challenge in that, sort of a base inclination to violence might undermine an effort to present yourselves as, protectors of the community. So I'm sure that there is a lot of complicated analysis that would go into not only how they craft these propaganda campaigns, but how they're actually able to execute them and carry them out. So I think we're going to have one or two questions from the audience. I hope people don't mind. I'm going to go first just because some people had sent me, 2 or 3 people had sent me similar questions. So perhaps I'll put this initially to all source. El Huaso, I would love your opinion as well. Because we often speak about the war in Ukraine, there is lots of coverage about how there are connections to the conflict there. I know All Source, you shared an article talking about Latin America as a nexus for Russian espionage, for example. But I had several people ask me, do the cartels respond to changes in the external environment? So, for example, if the war in Russia might have changed Russian domestic politics and that different Russian criminal organizations might be reaching out around the world in new ways, do we see the effects of sort of the ripples from the war, whether it be Russian criminal organizations, Turkish criminal organizations, and the like, affecting the cartels?
So I have not seen, the cartels are very, I have not seen any necessarily ripple effects per se, like directly connected to the Russian war. And I think, one of the things also that the cartels are probably going to be very, cognizant is that just as they have, there's kind of almost like this code of conduct, this unwritten code of conduct between the U.S., between the Mexican government cartels of what might be acceptable and not. And when one crosses the line, the other responds very violently to kind of reestablish that deterrence. The one area where the cartels acknowledge and realize they do not want to cross is the United States government. I mean, and so, any messaging or any actions that might tip the U.S. government to view cartels more than just, okay, you're here for the drugs, and the pressure of the U.S. government is already significantly heavy. Anything of that nature, I think, would cause problems. What I would say is that, though, when you're analyzing organized crime, right, and so in Mexico is obviously very dominated by the Mexican cartels, but when you look south in South America, and I'm in a group chat with other, more specific, kind of more broad in the Latin American side, we do see nexus with other criminal organizations, so specifically Ecuador, right? So Ecuador is a perfect example of a country that has local gangs that have been empowered by Mexican cartels, because Ecuador plays a prominent role in drug trafficking into the United States to the Pacific coast. But where we also see a huge influx of organized crime and mafia groups around the world. And, we see the Russians, of course, et cetera. But one specific mafia group that has very heavy influence in Ecuador is the Albanian mafia, right? And so, again, when we're analyzing this, and it's kind of maybe outside of this, but when we're talking about organized crime, it's very important to look how crime drives instability in the Western Hemisphere on its own without external influence, right? We can use Haiti as an example. I'm a huge believer, right? If I had to make one prediction for the next 5 to 10 years in organized crime in Latin America, is where I see like the Brazilian gangs, specifically the Red Commando gang, almost being just as the Mexican cartels took over from the Colombian cartels. There is a possibility that Brazilian gangs can almost eclipse the Mexican cartels. We're seeing the rise of the gangs in Venezuela, prison gang con Tren de Aragua, right? Everybody talks about MS-13, and I kind of joke like MS-13 is so 5 years ago, right? The main threat in Latin America now is really from the gangs, is almost Tren de Aragua, but they operate independently and in many ways, shapes, or form from what we see outside internationally, and I have not seen any necessary nexus, although there's a specific Mexican cartel group under Maya Zambada called the Russos. I've talked about a lot of the Russians. This group, the Russians, heavily utilize Russian propaganda memorabilia for propaganda purposes, but they have no nexus to the Russian government. And to be honest, if the Russian government even tried to have any sort of dealings with the Mexican cartels, or specifically this faction, I can see a lot of groups saying absolutely not. That's the last thing we need. We're already getting our heads up with the DEA and FBI and HSI. God help us if now we have the CIA and JSOC down our throats because the Russian government decided to do a dealing with us. I personally have not seen any of that nature, and I don't know if Waso, if you've seen anything. I've not.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen anything about the Ukraine war, but you did bring up the Ecuador situation. I think that is an example of them responding to, international happenings. Several years ago, the FARC demobilized parts of it, some didn't, and they've kind of vacated the Ecuador-Colombia border. And I've read some researchers and reporters who claim that that's when Mexican organized crime groups started, contracting Ecuadorian groups and sending some of their own men down to try and control that border region because it's so, so lucrative. But I don't know if that's, super proven. It's something that we might not know for a couple more years.
Well, that regional balance, the Brazilian, Mexican, Venezuelan influence is fascinating. And I wasn't aware of the Albanian-Ecuadorian connection, but that's the sort of thing that maybe I had in mind, or I think our question asker had in mind, in terms of, because of the sanctions and the change in flows of trade through Central Asia, Turkey, sort of that whole area of the world, whether that might just create different opportunities for, a group that might have, either buying or selling large quantities of narcotics, suddenly they make a connection with a new group whose connections have been cut because of, geopolitical changes, and then they create new connections. It would be fascinating to discover how the Albanians got influence in Ecuador in the first place.
So if I may, Michael, I think to your point, though, where I think it's important to highlight, I think the specific aspect of international relations, and it's not direct, but so let's analyze the fentanyl. Right, trade. Like the fentanyl we all know comes from China. Right, that is a very well documented where a lot of the precursor materials, and actually Luis, and I think you shared it on the NAS, kind of tweeted about like these are prices for chemical compounds necessary for the production of fentanyl. Right. And so a lot of times when I get to spaces or even in group chats and we have this conversation, people are like, well, is the Chinese government kind of utilizing the fentanyl trade to undermine, American stability and and threaten our national security and health? And what I say is that, look, in the end of the day, what it's all about is money. It's money, 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 money. But for the Chinese government, we've seen them do this, right? So although the Chinese government is not, we have no reporting publicly available that indicates that the Chinese government is actively pushing fentanyl as the CCP actively doing it. These are just criminal elements and people that run legitimate chemical companies that have no morals and are more than happy to sell to criminal organizations. But the Chinese government, though, will utilize the fentanyl issue as a lever, and in the counter-narcotics fight, they'll use that as a lever to show their pleasure or displeasure with the U.S. government. So let's say the U.S. government announces an arms deal with Taiwan. Well, then the Chinese government will come up and say, well, we're halting counter-narcotic cooperation with the United States government because you're giving weapons to Taiwan. So it's not necessarily that they utilize drugs as a tool as to undermine America, but they'll have the counter-narcotic fight as a leverage. And if so, the United States government does something that is not beneficial for them as they see, let's say, Taiwan, for example, or something else, they can just halt any counter-narcotic cooperation that they have and look the other way. And I think that in that way, yes, that's where we do see kind of where the international crisis and diplomatic tensions between countries, like specifically China, might influence cartel organizations and groups and leveraging their drug trade into the United States.
Well, this has, been a fascinating kind of wander through the current events in Mexico. We've started to get a little bit further abroad And that just highlights the complexity of, not only within Mexico, there are all those factors, politics, violence, drugs, the impact of U.S. policy, but then there are all these regional factors as well that make it so complicated. So it's terrific that not only do our three guests, Allsource, El Huaso, and Luis, pay close attention to it, but I understand there's even a broader group that they tap into who are regularly sharing notes and following these issues. And so I knew that we would only barely get a bit of an introduction. But my hope, again, was to, having already spoken with Allsource in the past, highlight a few more of the people that he worked with, and to keep the questions fresh in the mind of our audience. And so I think what I'll say is that, as I said to Luis, Allsource, El Huaso, if you guys ever work on a project that you'd like to highlight, let us know. If you think there's any way that sort of our broader community can help you out, maybe connect you with sources or reporters or the like, likewise, let us know. And we'd love to have you back and chat with us anytime.
Thanks so much for hosting this. This was a really interesting discussion, and I really enjoy y'all for hosting and moderating everything. And thank you to all the listeners who showed up and listened to us talk, and wishing everyone a good night.
No, same. I appreciate it, and again, I think I think what we would like, I think the message that I would like to send with the space, and again, thank you, Bon, for hosting this, is it's just highlighting that just as any international war or conflict, the complexity and how, we never even talked about kind of, the issue of, migration and immigration, et cetera, in the United States. And I think the underlying message is that this is a very complex issue, and that the ability to really properly analyze it and do it takes years. And I think a lot of people, people come to me and say, oh, you're the, people say like, oh, you're the cartel expert, et cetera. And I will be flat out, I am not in any way, shape, or form consider myself an expert at this. I feel like I just scratched the surface and to try to dig down. And as you said, Michael, we're the biggest bang for my buck in all this, and my ability to at least, grow as an account is really to highlight the indispensable work that Luis, El Huaso, Lara Moscura, Bertel Ambit, and many, many, many others in trying to provide as best as a picture as possible, and to understand to do this alone is impossible, and you need that community. And we're never going to probably get 100%, but at least give you 50%, which is better than nothing.
And so I encourage everybody, not only our guests, but those other sources, Allsource referred to, Borderland Beat, Latam Obscuro, check their accounts out and consider giving them a follow. I know I follow them all, just because, getting the raw, often, unvarnished coverage gets a lot more of the nuance that gets lost, certainly when it's coming from an area that maybe doesn't get as much coverage in the mainstream media. Terrific resources. And so I'd invite both of you hang out as long as you're able to. I think at this point, we're going to shift to getting into some updates in connection with the war in Ukraine. There was a lot that happened this week. We may not have time to cover it all. We probably have an hour and a half to 2 hours left in our conversation. This week, in fact, a lot happened today, but there were the United Nations meetings, the UN Annual General Assembly. President Zelensky was in the United States. He met with the Senate. He met with President Biden. There was a lot of political machinations in the US about funding for weapon systems. So we're going to try to get into as much of that as we can. At this point, I'm going to take maybe 5 minutes just to run through a couple of resources that I normally cover at the beginning of our chats. But because our guests had limited time, I jumped over it initially. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of interesting OSINT opportunities, resources, and kind of updates on the progress of a couple of friends sort of in our community. So if you have a look at the item in the nest, these are just a couple of resources here for you. The first is, because I know we have some pretty sophisticated people who listen to us, there's an opportunity to be an analyst for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And so they are looking for an investigative journalist to reach out to them to apply for a short-term fellowship, which could be a really cool opportunity. They do some great work looking at financial flows and corruption around the world. The second item in that tweet under resources is from a friend of ours, Cyber Detective, who often puts up daily resources, tools, and the like. In this case, Cyber Detective just highlighted once again the work of Sophia Santos, who on Twitter goes by the handle Growlhix, and she, every couple of weeks is putting together a practice exercise for OSINT to highlight different types of skills, and she's now up to 20 total exercises. We've highlighted her work before occasionally. We've also highlighted some people who have taken Sophia's exercises and done walkthroughs of them to explain how they solve them. So it's a pretty cool sort of reference set that you can do some great learning with. The last resource in that tweet you'll see is a new training course that's being put together by the Global Investigative Journalism Network, who does a lot of work with Bellingcat. And they're offering a program. It's a 6-week cyber investigation training course, and it is free, as I understand it. It's beginning in October, so I think you have to register in the next week or so. And if that's the sort of thing you're interested in, don't miss out. The second item in the nest, again, I'm not going to break these items out because I just want to move through them quickly, but they're interesting examples of work. The first of which, and so this sort of block is themed around some work that Bellingcat has been doing. The first of which is a report that Bellingcat has put out just in the last few days about the chaos and crisis as Azerbaijan has attacked the Nagorno-Karabakh region. And hopefully we'll have time to get up to some updates on what actually happened there. But I wanted to highlight that Bellingcat very quickly came out with a set of reporting based on just the breaking open source information, and Bellingcat does great work at that. And obviously it's an ongoing situation, so if you want to get up to speed so you can follow the nuances of the issues there, it's probably a great starting point. The second item there, under examples, is some work that the satellite company Umbra has now done. And we've highlighted them before. They seem to be very friendly, very supporting of open source work. And so Joe Morrison, who is an executive there, wanted to highlight that this is the first time that Umbra has actually coordinated with Bellingcat. And so they made a fair bit of data from the Nagorno-Karabakh region available. They have started to do this a little bit where if there's an area of sort of public interest, they'll make their satellite imagery free, sort of under Creative Commons licensing for, just to support broader analysis, which is, I think, a really cool approach. Having a look at Joe Morrison's tweets, he also highlighted an interesting angle, which is just to say that sometimes people will look at the work that the satellite companies do and how they work very closely with the military. And he was highlighting the work of so a competitor of his in the satellite imagery industry, Planet, and how often they're supporting the U.S. military in crisis response, whether that be humanitarian or otherwise, and just saying that even if you're not particularly supportive of military activity, there are a lot of ways that coordination between the military and sort of the open source sat intelligence industries can work together on projects that I think everybody can recognize as being a good thing. The last item under examples here, you'll see I had started with the phrase ethical dilemmas in OSINT. And this is a new article that's been released by Gian Fiorella, who is the Director of Research and Training at Bellingcat, that just breaks down some examples on ethical problems that are common and some of the best ways to handle them. The next set of items are a couple of reports. Again, as we demonstrated with our discussion about the cartels, we're looking at open source analysis broadly, and not only in connection with the war in Ukraine. So looking at that third item in the nest, there have been some interesting reports on developments in Africa in the last couple of days. The first of which is media coverage. It's from a Canadian newspaper, but they're covering a report that was put together by the United Nations into some continuing violence that's occurring in Ethiopia, even after some peace agreements have been reached in the Eritrean regions of the country. And this, I think, just speaks to the reality that if people have been mobilized for military purposes, and then there's a sharp transition where they are not quickly integrated back into the economy, that it unfortunately violence is often the result. And so it's great that the UN has some committees who are out there keeping an eye and reporting on it, as that's the sort of thing that can lead to instability in a region that is already unstable. Likewise, there was a report put out by the Center for Information Resilience highlighting the ongoing fighting in Khartoum in Sudan. And so if you just want to stay up to date on the state of essentially the civil war there, I don't think it's a great point to start with this report from Center for Information Resilience. Interestingly, we'll probably get to it in a few minutes, there is a bit of a nexus to Ukraine, as there were some reports that Ukraine may have been supporting potentially drone strikes against Wagner-affiliated groups in Sudan. And so you can get some unexpected ties back. Looking at the Center for Information Resilience, you'll see the third item down is another report that they did on the targeting of hospitals by the Russians, targeting of medical facilities, particularly in Kherson. And so they've released a longer report about that, and builds on the idea that it is a systematic approach that the Russians are taking to targeting those facilities. And I think there's actually an accompanying article in, I believe it was the UK magazine, the UK newspaper, The Telegraph. The last item I threw in here for interest's sake, it's under the phrase Tiananmen Square AI. And I put this in here because occasionally I'm trying to provide examples of the influence that AI-generated imagery is having in obscuring or making it more difficult to tell the truth. And so you'll see this tweet from Joseph Cox, who I think is with 404 Media. Apparently, if you were to search in Google for Tank Man, which would often be a phrase associated with the man who stood in front of the tank column in Tiananmen Square, apparently the top results now are AI-generated imagery, particularly one that is supposed to be a selfie. And of course, nobody was taking selfies on Tiananmen Square. And it just goes to, if you're not sophisticated, you don't know the history, there are probably plenty of people who would just be interested in the information out there searching, come across this, and you can see the potential for the understanding of history to be distorted in this way. The next set of material, last before we get into the direct updates on the war, speaks to some developments sort of in our smaller community. And so it starts with the phrase Russian storage bases. And so that's a thread from the account HIMARSed. And this was a little over a week ago, but I thought a really cool resource. It includes the lat and longitude coordinates of many Russian storage yards for equipment. And I've highlighted threads that HIMARSed has made before, where he's taken subsets of these looked at the imagery and counted specific types of vehicles, BMPs and the like. But having all the coordinates presented in one place is pretty handy. I know there are some others who maintain sort of a global map of Russian bases, but this is just, one more option if you want to dig into it. The next item is under the phrase 3D printed drone parts, and this is a follow-up. We had our friend Daniel speak with us last week to discuss from his experience in building and operating FPV drones. Last week, he spoke to us about the video transmission feeds, how they're not encrypted, what the implications of those are, how they can affect tactics. I thought his thread this week was interesting, where he went online on some of the forums where they share 3D printing, essentially blueprints, and went to find whether anybody had been sharing blueprints specifically intended for Russian drones, and said that he found a few. And so he did a quick analysis. These might be perhaps the more amateur ones if they're being shared publicly. But, he spoke about how it seems like those designs that are available aren't optimized for large scale production, and suggesting there were some ways in which they were likely to fail based on his experience. I hadn't seen anybody take that approach of trying to find 3D printing blueprints before, so I thought it was interesting enough I'd highlight to you guys. A couple last items related to the community. One is that apparently the account Aleph, that goes by the handle No It's My Turn, has met with some significant health problems. And I know he was due to appear on the OSINT Bunker podcast a few weeks ago, which was delayed, and now they've come out and explained that he's unwell. So I just thought I would mention it because, he's come out with it publicly, and folks are suggesting that, sending him best wishes and noting that there are ways to help him. So I thought I would mention that. I also wanted to highlight, again, our friend Constantine, who comes to chat with us from time to time, often runs programs to support units in Ukraine, and I like to highlight when he's successful. And so they, Liberty Ukraine Foundation, once again completed another program. So I just wanted to congratulate Constantine on that, and note that, if that's the sort of thing you're interested in, keep an eye on Constantine's profile, as I'm sure they'll have another campaign coming up soon. Finally, and I've spoken about this idea about how you professionalize a hobby or a side project, and specifically I've spoken about the GPS Jam program that's been developed by John Wiseman, that tracks the GPS reception levels of aircraft as they're flying around the world, and often will give hints when there's jamming going on that's affecting a region, and you can get some great open source information in that way. And he's talking about wanting to build out the GPS Jam program more fully. I think I shared a few weeks ago a prospective feature set. He had said, here are the things I'd like to add. And I'm highlighting it because he's once again debating, kind of publicly, that he's been reached out to by some corporate organizations who are asking for specific features. And he's debating whether to, essentially sell an interest in the project to these corporate backers, which might limit availability of the more advanced feature sets for the general user base. Or essentially he's saying he would just prefer, and he would find it simpler if he just started a crowdfunding project to support the initiative. And he, I haven't seen yet that he's put out a link to say, hey, support me here. But I highlight it because this is a debate that I suspect lots of people have. We've talked about the professionalization of some of the accounts like GeoConfirmed and so on, or War Translated, and how they have to, as they dedicate more and more of their time, partly because they're in such high demand, they have to figure out how to support, servers and dedicating more of their time to their projects. And so it's the same idea with GPS Jam. So I highlight it because he may come out and say, hey, I'm going to start an initiative to do some fundraising. If you like that kind of open source approach and you want to support it, keep an eye on his account. Okay, I will get into some updates on the war in Ukraine. And I'll start with some quick updates on the offensive. If you'll just bear with me, I'll put that material up.
And I'll take a quick moment to do some housekeeping. Thank you for coming. If you're new here, there's a nest up above our heads. There's sources for pretty much everything we talk about up there. If you go to the very right-hand side of the nest, you'll have to scroll back a little ways. The third one in you'll find is a link to the YouTube, and you can go there to watch replays of pretty much all of the spaces that we do. If you're looking for any item from the nest later in the week, you'll find that shared to the space tweet, which you can always retweet out and ask other people to come chat with us. And if you want to come up and chat with us right now, hit the request mic button that's on the left-hand side of your screen at the bottom.
Thanks for that. And so I'll just remind you, as usual, that we're not trying to follow the, minute by minute updates along the front. There are terrific accounts that do that. We're looking at sort of a brief overview, just so that if you haven't been in the news, you'll hear generally how things are progressing along the front. And we'll look at a couple of more strategic implications. But if you do want the details about the front line, to help with that, I include a tweet that contains links to many of the great mapping projects. So that's the first item that's in the nest. You'll see, as usual, I've included links to maps from the Institute for the Study of War, a war mapper, Andrew Perpetua, DEFMON, Project Owl, Deep State, GeoConfirmed, and I've included a weather update from our friend David Helms. And so the second item in the nest is just as an overview. This is a graphic that DEFMON prepared earlier today, highlighting the change in the front line over the last week. And you'll see that much of the change is just the push to the southeast toward Verbov. And so it's sort of slow but steady on that particular axis, which is great news. However, there is even more positive news just in the last couple of hours. And you'll probably have seen lots of accounts reporting that the Ukrainians are now moving some more of their heavy equipment past that second fortification line of the Russians, moving west to east toward Verbov. And that suggests that, we had this debate over almost 2 weeks now about, is it an infiltration? Is it a breach? The fact that they're now moving up heavy equipment suggests that it is a breach, which is great news, and that probably the intensity of fighting in that direction toward Verbov will increase in the coming days. So we may have some developments there. So check out that thread from George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War. Highlighting the developments in progress, the fourth item is a thread by Tataragami, and he just took a slightly different approach to looking at the progress bypassing that defensive line. I liked his the additional analysis that he included on the satellite imagery, highlighting in text boxes, here are these defensive lines, here are the Dragon's Teeth, here are the anti-vehicle trenches, and here is the scarring from artillery strikes, here's smoke that show you, if you were looking at this raw imagery, even though you wouldn't have it all highlighted for you, these are the things that you would be looking for to determine, oh, great, we now have, significant movement past these defensive lines. The fifth item in the nest also highlights progress that was necessary or likely necessary to turn it from, an infiltration of the second defensive line into a breach. And so this is the tweet from GeoConfirmed, where they're highlighting the progress that Ukraine has made in clearing further down the trench lines. Having breached it initially, I had seen some analysts a week ago, 2 weeks ago, talk about how, the defenses are oriented in a direction. Having captured some of the trench lines, it's a little bit easier to move along the trench lines, and that's what's highlighted, the movement along those lines by GeoConfirmed here. And that gives you a sense of how the Ukrainians were able to, it took a long time to breach the line initially, but the clearing is a little bit faster, and now the equipment is coming through that breach. The last item in this block, sixth item in the nest, this is anecdotal, but the video highlighted here by P-Style 1 is of a Russian self-propelled gun that's taking artillery fire. But what they're suggesting is that this is moving through an area where there are Russian defenses. And the thing they're pointing to is that these vehicles, the self-propelled gun is hit by a near artillery strike, and the crew abandons the vehicle and it continues to drive out, into the field, and until it's ultimately destroyed by a second artillery hit. But they're highlighting that there don't appear to be any landmines in this area. And again, it's anecdotal, but the suggestion is that as Ukraine penetrates, through the second defensive layer, reports had been that defenses weren't as densely constructed, and in particular, there may be less slowdown due to mines. But anyway, that's the hope. Exit, please go ahead.
All source. I wondered if you could talk about what other things we should be watching for in the next couple of weeks to know if that's an accurate representation across the line, or if that just happens to be this one place in this one video.
So I think that's a good question. Obviously, we have to look through, to see kind of, I think the video, kind of the vehicles, the Ukrainian, and I would call it a motorized element. Although in the U.S. Army we don't necessarily use that term, we would kind of use more like infantry or mechanized formations, kind of going through. It's interesting. They were mostly wheeled. We saw a lot of dismounted operations, and I know yesterday I had space in kind of talking to Wolverine, who we've dealt with as well. It does indicate that a lot of this is kind of infantry still clearing the trenches. Maybe there's probably some engineer assets as well with those infantry teams to try to continue to expand that. But at least the fact that we're seeing vehicles kind of at least operating that close to past the first line, the Sorokin line, does indicate that at least some element of the breach has occurred. Now, again, I think, Michael, in one of your spaces in the past, I've mentioned, when what we're talking about of these breaching operations is the intent is to create a mobility corridor, right, through an avenue of approach. And mobility corridors are important because the size of it determines what echelon can go through, right? Generally in the U.S. Army, we consider 3 kilometers a brigade size element, right? And I don't think we're nowhere near that, that much yet, or just basically what's publicly available. Maybe they are, maybe they have done it, but it clearly shows that the Ukrainians are trying to establish breaching points across this to enable successive offensive operations. But actually, I think what kind of addresses that, one of the ways that we're starting to see that the Russians are concerned about this and are trying to halt it is, let's not forget, a couple of weeks ago, we started to get more reports of the Russians deploying kind of the reinforcements, they consider their reserve elements, into that, specifically that area of operations, right? So clearly, I think the Russians identify that this is kind of the main aspect of the defensive line, that the Russians are more comfortable doing an area defense to kind of to attrit and force the Ukrainians to culminate. We haven't seen this, what we would consider maneuver defense, where you kind of retrograde while you attrit enemy forces before they reach the final objective. I think, if anything, reporting that we consistently get of reinforcements arriving is probably an indication that the Ukrainians are having at least some level of success and that the Russians are concerned. But I know we got Andrew and Constantine joining, and I would love to hear their opinions as well. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I just want to state that I've seen this talked about in that this breach. People are making it sound like this breach was in one place, or I guess it kind of was. But Ukraine is advancing along 3 different axes from this breach. So it is actually pretty significant in size. It's at least 3 kilometers wide that they're breaching and moving in 3 different directions. So they moved directly south, which was the video that we saw yesterday. And they moved directly east, which was also in that video, but people kind of ignored it for some reason. And then today, another video came out of them moving directly south from that other eastern point. So now they're moving south in two different locations and still moving east on top of that. Now, the easternmost movement, the other day, Russia posted a video of them doing a large counterattack with, I believe they're VDV. They're driving around in a BMD4. So they did this big counterattack with an armored vehicle, with an IV, and they never really showed what they were engaging, and it makes me wonder whether they were engaging these Ukrainian IFVs or strikers or whatever, because that counterattack occurred in just a little bit further east than where we see Ukraine now in these videos, but we don't know the timeline of these events. So, and it is important that we don't know the timeline, because these videos could be several days old. We're not entirely sure. We know that they happened after September 10th, but we don't. I don't think we've been able to pin down a time more, closer to or more accurate than that. So, sometime in the past 10 days, it happened.
And if I may just expand, sorry, I know I said you raised your hand, but I think I didn't want to kind of dodge your question, but I think one of the next things that I would then, based on what Andrew provided, right, is how do we see the Ukrainians continue this offensive operation? Do we continue to see an emphasis on dismounted operations, right, that are slower but clearly have shown at least it minimizes casualties compared to what we see? Or do we see the point where the Ukrainians now start to transition to more of to utilizing more armored formations, right? So if I'm looking at this from like not OSINT or nothing like that, just kind of like putting my military hat on, that's kind of the indications. If and it's great what Andrew said about kind of the depth and the ability of how much they breached, and more importantly, it's not just the obstacles of how breached they are. When I'm talking about mobility corridors, also the terrain and how enabled that is, and I think Andrew is probably way more of an expert to kind of analyze that than I would from what he analyzed on the terrain and how conducive. But I think one of the indications that I would see that maybe the Ukrainians are prioritizing more kind of like the speed and they feel comfortable with the route to kind of pushing with firepower and speed is, do we start seeing company-sized element of armor formation? When I specifically say armor formations like your Leopard 2s, your Abrams, even your Leopard 1s, your T-72s, et cetera, from the Ukrainians at more large scale. So a company, in U.S. formations about 15 tanks, 16 tanks, depending, the M-tone, et cetera. That 3 platoons would be 12 Abram tanks. And it would be your platoons would be the spearhead, and the company element would stay back. That is kind of what I would to see if they decided to transition from what we've kind of seen now of more of this dismounted operation, clearing, et cetera. Do they feel comfortable going back to what we originally saw probably in the earlier June? Do we start going back that because now the Ukrainians feel comfortable that one, the breach is substantial enough to support it, and the kind of like the obstacles have been attrited enough that enables that. And I think it's important to highlight, though, when we're talking about obstacles and mines, a lot of people focus a lot on that, and that's not the biggest threat. What those obstacles and mines do, the primary focus of that is to fix. You want to fix the opposing force. And then how the Russians would achieve success is through artillery. The United States actually uses artillery and obstacles to fix, and then we use maneuver to destroy. What the Russians will do is they will fix you an area and then utilize artillery to destroy. So had the Ukrainians believed through their targeting, either HIMARS, artillery, drones, etc., one, had they treated Russian artillery assets to the point where they're not as big as a concern. Two, had they destroyed the obstacles to prevent them from being fixed. And three, did they create mobility corridors that then enable these armor formations to go through? The Ukrainians can achieve all that and still decide to go dismounted, and that's completely fine. I just think that the utilization of those types of armor formations, I think the Ukrainians would mean to me speculating that they feel comfortable enough that now they can push the Russians pretty hard, and that might actually have a cascading effect that instead of it running a more slower kind of offensive operations, they might feel comfortable that maybe we might have a repeat of, let's say, Kharkiv in 2022 if we see the Ukrainians going back to that type of maneuver operations.
which sounds promising. I know that Andrew had a brief thread he put out earlier today where he had said, it's not necessarily attrition until you get a breakthrough. It's, likely to be attrition. I can't remember the term, not mobilization, but, sort of a more mobile fight, back to attrition, back to a more mobile fight. So I would be curious thinking about if they are taking a more mobile approach for a time, where are sort of the likely bounds of that? Because, saying that they're through the second defensive line, it's known that in most directions there are additional defensive lines that they'll have to counter. And it's not clear how much those will slow them down. But, also to your point, perhaps they're taking that into account in terms of attrition of Russian artillery, where they think that even if there are a few more obstacles that might slow them down and or fix, that they can handle the risk that's implied, by a few more sets of obstacles. Anyway, Exit, why don't you go ahead and we'll see if that generates any more discussion.
All source, said my favorite word, terrain, which lets me ask Andrew about the topography in that area and if he could kind of enlighten us.
Well, I know the topography of where they are right now, but let me quickly look at where they're going, because where they are right now is rather flat, and I believe it is going to remain flat. But I'll just check. Give me one sec. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, it's basically flat. Yeah, it's not going to change much. So, Rabatina was on like a hill, and there's like this kind of low ground to the east of it, and that really kind of hurt Ukraine. They did that really disastrous assault where they tried to push through that giant trench line there, and then they lost like 9 armored vehicles in a day. That was a bit of a disaster, but once they got on top of, into Rabatina and they took the town, the rest of this terrain is more or less flat. I mean, there is some undulation to it, but nothing is like super significant at this point. At least not for a little ways.
And just a reminder, usually I'll mention it, but I forgot when I was going through the maps earlier, that if you want a more detailed breakdown, Andrew does do a live stream of his maps where he screen shares his map and then he walks through the latest changes. And then he does those talks on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern and Fridays at 3 p.m. Eastern. So, that's coming up in, 16 hours? So you could always tune in tomorrow afternoon and you'll have not only the benefit of Andrew's insight, but you'll be able to follow along with the video of his map. So check that out. So if, I'm always happy to, I particularly appreciate all sources analysis. I'm always happy to take any, thoughts on debating sort of what the next steps could be. So if you want to, put in your thoughts on that, feel free. In lieu of that, I'm going to keep going with a couple of updates. And my approach is to go from the east and move along the line, start in the west and move along the line toward the east. So we spoke about the breach of the line near Verbov, and one other area that we had been paying attention to in the last few days was the Ukrainian capture of the villages of Klishivka and Andriivka, just to the south of Bakhmut. And that, includes down some successes reported down as far as Kurdyumivka. And there's a thread in the nest. It's the second item up there that speaks to a detail I didn't realize, but it's the thread from Tatargami, where he notes that there's a rail line that actually runs through that whole area. And that essentially that rail line has become a little bit of a natural front line, I guess, because of the break in it and the associated tree lines. my assumption of why that rail line is relevant. And it's just interesting that they've made progress, sort of to that line along a wider front. And now the question will be, where do they move next along that line? And this was as of 2 days ago, so it's possible that Ukraine may have made further advances. But I just thought it interesting that sort of regional successes can consolidate, and then there's this sort of man-made barrier that sort of draws a defining line. Oh yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, what you said is all accurate, but I just want to state one thing. Russia is doing massive counterattacks. They counterattacked like all day today, and so I'm not sure much has changed. It's just because Russia is very upset. They're very, very upset. So that's kind of the situation right now.
And we can't take it for granted, but we've had fairly consistent reports, that Russia had been conducting in several cases an unexpectedly active defense. And, the reports were that Ukraine was having considerable success at defeating the counterattacks, which probably is contributing to the attritional effect, which is great news. And so related to that, just before I get to hands, is the third item in the nest, where if we move up a little bit further north into Luhansk Oblast, there have been reports that Russia has been pushing there for weeks now. And there was some evidence recently of some additional Russian pushes that relied a little bit more on armor. And the available open source evidence suggests that Ukraine has not only stopped those pushes, but that Russia has lost, a notable amount of armor in those pushes. So I think that's also demonstrative of, it seems like Russia is not successful in many of its counteroffensive efforts at the moment. Exit, go ahead.
One thing I've never thought to ask on a Tuesday when I'm on your stream with you is there anything defensive-wise, specifically trench lines, things like that, in between the railroad and the highway that they are working towards?
Yeah, pretty much every tree line is defended, whether it be with trenches or whatnot. And some of these farm fields have trenches built through like the middle of the field. But I don't think these trenches they're nowhere near the scope of the South, for example, like the whole Zaporizhzhia, like they're nowhere near that built up. But they're still probably going to be pretty significant obstacles. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for that, guys. And again, we only do a very general overview of developments along the front. Do check out those mapping initiatives. Check out Andrew's stream tomorrow if you want to delve way down into the details. The next couple of things I wanted to highlight were some notable Ukrainian deeper strikes. Now, there are so many strikes being exchanged by both sides that following them all, like in a way that you understand what the targets were and their significance, is it's a big challenge on its own. So I don't try to report on all the strikes. I pick a few that seem like they may have some broader significance. And so the first of those was the claim from, I think just 2 days ago, that the Ukrainians carried out a strike, apparently using Storm Shadow or Scalp missiles, that would have struck the protected command post of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. And so if you have a look at the fourth item in the nest, this is a thread that was put together by Radio and Nukes, who's with us, looking at where that was, some basics on what kind of facility it was. And if I'm not mistaken, this might be one of the first instances where they've been targeting sort of a protected or like a bunker-like headquarters. I know there have been other strikes on headquarters, but mostly ones that had been sort of hastily put together in hotels and sort of similar facilities. So it's interesting that they, attacked a more protected bunker. I have not heard what any losses on the Russian side in terms of personnel would be, given that it's a headquarters. But obviously there's the potential for it to be significant. The The next item back speaks to the same issue, the fifth item. It's the tweet by Mark Krutov, and he includes a GIF that shows the destruction of the building. But again, because it's a bunker, the visible destruction doesn't necessarily reflect the more significant part, which would have occurred underground. And so Mark shares a couple of additional resources there, including some geolocation and some details from people they interviewed who spoke at the facility. And so we'll go to Exit and Radio and Nukes. If you have any points you thought were worth adding in based on your investigation, just let us know. Go ahead, Exit.
So my question was for you, Nukes. I know that there were other strikes in that general complex, and I was wondering if anybody had sorted out exactly what else was hit there.
Well, I just got an image of the whole facility, and I'm looking through it and getting ready to make a post now. I can say that on the building that was hit that we've seen other imagery of, there were, it's like two metal buildings with a kind of a concrete cube building in the middle, and the southern one seems to have been hit. After a little bit of enhancement on the image, you can see what looks to be nearly a perfect 4-meter circle underneath where the building used to be. And that's what I'm getting ready to put the post out on. So stand by for that. I'm very close on it, but I'm going to say it's pretty likely that that's the impact crater or hole left by the storm shadow, if that was the munition used. So stand by for a few minutes and I'll get this out here and you can have a look at it.
We should have added the breaking hashtag to the space name, because you probably didn't come expecting we would be breaking news. So the sixth item back, moving to some other significant strikes in the last few days. This sixth item, tweet from Rob Lee, includes some imagery of various strikes that happened. Russia and Ukraine traded very significant strikes last night. It appeared most of the Ukrainian strikes were conducted by long-range drones, whereas the Russian strikes last night were apparently primarily cruise missiles. And we'll get to that in a moment. But there were reports that Ukraine particularly was targeting airfields in Crimea. So if you have a look at the seventh item, it comes from Ukrainian front. This is unconfirmed. These are the claims, but it includes the claim that they may have affected up to 12 aircraft. Now, when the Ukrainians have made claims about affecting Russian aircraft, sometimes the number is downgraded. Sometimes it's possible that more aircraft were affected than we can ultimately get visual evidence of. But they also say that this was a training base for some Iranian UAVs. And I saw one source suggest that some air defense systems may also have been damaged in these strikes. I've been focusing on preparing for the space for the last couple of hours, so it's possible that SAT imagery or battle damage assessments may have come out, but by the time we started, I hadn't seen any. So this will be, these attacks, particularly on the Saki Air Base, will be ones to keep an eye on in the next day or so to see how successful they were. Okay, I'll put a little bit more material up if you just bear with me. There were a few more deep strikes. Again, because they were so recent, we don't have information on exactly how significant they were. There were reports that the city of Tula had a blackout, and it's not clear what was hit there, whether the blackout is because energy infrastructure was struck. But I did see some people note that Tula is the site where there's an extremely large munitions factory. And so even if it wasn't hit directly, if their electricity is cut, then it's cutting production at the plant, which is good news. So that first item in the nest was just highlighting that there was the strike on Tula. Again, if anybody has more specific information in the last couple of hours, feel free to come up and update us. There was also the second item in the nest. You'll see links to an article from The Drive that's in the tweet by Tyler Rogaway about claims that also came out yesterday that some partisans, fighting against the Russians, carried out a sabotage raid on an airbase near Moscow. I'll have to double check what the name of that airbase was. It's like Cherkovsky, I think. And the suggestion was that several aircraft on the ground were damaged. I saw some folks who were saying those aircraft may not have been in particularly flight-worthy shape, but it's notable if only for the location where it took place, the fact that it would have to be partisan activity. And so again, I think we don't have actual confirmation of the damage there, but that's one more spot that people will be keeping an eye on. So the folks who do satellite imagery work are going to have a couple of busy days. The third item in the nest is a report I alluded to earlier. This is a tweet from Christian Tribert. He works for the visual investigations team at the New York Times. And CNN initially reported, and then Christian from New York Times sort of corroborated that his sources independently were confirming reports that FPV drones were being delivered to Sudan by Ukraine, and that those FPV drones were being used against the Rapid Support Forces, which is the group that is battling the incumbent government in Sudan. But the idea is that there may have been a Wagner connection to the RSF, and that the Ukrainian delivered drones were used against either Wagner entities or Wagner affiliates. But the details of this seem to be murky. And again, I'm highlighting it because it's an area of interest, first of all, and that we should keep our eyes on to see what comes of it. I haven't yet heard about any diplomatic fallout, in terms of, Sudan or anybody else objecting. But, it comes with interesting timing given Ukraine's diplomatic push at the United Nations and in the U.S. So we'll see if there's any consequences, of course, which should follow confirmation first. The fourth item is just sort of a thought-provoking piece, because OSINT work, right? There's the collection and verification, but then there's the analysis, the asking, well, what is the potential result of this? And there are some accounts that do a great job at that. I like this account, Hostile Spectrum, who is a cybersecurity researcher, but he talks about, all kinds of impacts. And he makes the point, if it is confirmed that Ukraine is facilitating strikes outside of the existing theater of combat, what does that imply to the Russians? Are the Russians inspired or freed to take new types of strikes if they feel like this is an escalatory step in terms of territory? And I think that Hostile Spectrum was interested in this because he thought, is there potential that Russia could respond with more cyber fires, essentially? And so, this is speculative. We don't know. The reason I'm highlighting it is because an important part of analysis is to think about, well, what could potentially flow from this? And that's an item that we get into sometimes, but it's less evident with things like this allegation about the strike in Sudan. The last point in this block is the fifth item in the nest. It's the tweet from P-Style 1. There were many accounts that highlighted this. The Ukrainian main intelligence directorate came out and credited the ongoing information that they're getting from the ICE-I satellite system, which is a deal it's a private satellite, and a considerable amount of time was purchased on it by the private organization, the Serhiy Prytula Foundation, which the Prytula Foundation has also been very active in developing long-range drones. I think it may have been their organization that developed the Bober that we're seeing used quite heavily. And the main intelligence directorate noted that they've been using info from ICE-I in a fair number of their targeting tasks, and I believe they even attributed taking some information from that to assist them in the missile strike on the dry docks in Sevastopol, which is really interesting because it brings together a bunch of areas we focused on over the war: crowdfunding, SAT imagery, real-time targeting, sort of whether they're public about it or not. It partly makes me wonder if the intelligence directorate is speaking about it at this time because they want to hype it up in the hope that it's worth the risks of highlighting it, in the hope of driving more donations so that they can sort of keep refreshing the fund and continue to get access to this kind of imagery. But again, that's speculation on my part. Exit, go ahead.
Just with the Sudan strikes, I presume, and if anybody here knows, I would love to hear some details, that there might be some historical precedents for things like that. And I don't have the history knowledge to know what that would be, but if anybody does, I would love to hear it. To which conflict it would have been in and what kind of strikes there were. Obviously not UAV strikes, but strikes outside of the current conflict area.
Sure. So you might be appealing to the historians among us. We'd be happy to hear any insight you guys have. My guess is that there have probably been many instances of sort of out of theater escalation. Not many come to mind at the moment, but that might be a great idea to reach out to some of our friends who are really into history, Polaris, Random, and so on, and maybe inspire a little mini space in the next couple of days. One question I was going to ask to Nukes is that ICE-I satellite, do you have any idea how similar that is to the Umbra type satellites? I think it's also synthetic aperture radar. Do you know very much about that one?
Yeah, they're both X-band SAR, so they'll be in the 10 gigahertz range or 3 centimeters in wavelength, and they're pretty similar. I don't, off the top of my head, know what the resolution differences are or anything like that, but they're quite similar. Is to be almost the same, at least looking at them in most cases. So pretty similar tech between the two.
Oh, two quick questions, and this is just because I don't know and I'm curious. Are they both just individual sats, or does Umbra have more than one? That's question one. Question two is, do you know, is ICE-I satellite imagery commercially available in the same way? Like, can you just task it, or is it more private? I just don't know how that works.
I don't know that much about ICE-I. As far as that, I know they do have commercial product, as far as I know. And they both have multiple satellites. I'm thinking either 4 or 6 for Umbra off the top of my head. I'd have to look at the Wikipedia page and find out. And ICE-I has a few as well. That's what gives them really good revisit time, to where you can look at an area more often. The more satellites in a constellation, obviously, the more they go over different parts of the Earth. So that was one of the big selling points with ICE-I, as well as with SAR. You don't have to worry about the weather; it can see through that.
Yeah, I've been thinking in the last week or so, it would be really interesting to develop a sort of like a little infographic on who the commercial sat imagery providers are, that would lay out, what's their tech, how big are their constellations, what's their available resolution, sort of broad pricing guidelines, just so that if somebody were interested in getting into this, sort of at a glance, they could understand what the universe of sort of OSINT sat image availability is. But anyway, perhaps we can take that offline and maybe watch this space. Maybe in a week or two, we'll have something for you. So continuing on the idea of strikes, I mentioned that Ukraine and Russia exchanged strikes. And so we've been highlighting for the last week or two, as Ukraine has been reporting, number one, that they're preparing for the potential of Russian strikes as against their electrical infrastructure and infrastructure that's necessary for them during the winter. So they've been building up to this. There were also reports that Ukraine might be reprioritizing its air defense systems to defend those same assets. And we also last week heard speculation from a Ukrainian official that they thought Russia might have been saving up a stock of their precision-guided missiles so that when they do launch an attack on infrastructure, it's more concentrated in time. And it seems like that attack, very likely not the final, but a concentrated attack was conducted 1 day ago. And so you'll see the first item in the nest is a Financial Times article that covers where those attacks occurred. It did lead to partial blackouts in 4 or 5 different regions. But I think that many of those regions have been, they've had some repair and some reconnection. And I think Ukrainians have been specifically preparing for this. Speaking to that idea that Russia may have been saving up some munitions for this kind of a campaign, the second item in the nest, the tweet from Rob Lee, you'll see that the apparently they launched 43 KH-101s and several KH-55, and the Ukrainians reported that they shot down 36 of the 43. Which is, a good success rate, but it seems like it's not quite as high a success rate as against the Shaheds, the Garan drones, where Ukraine has a very high success rate. So a few more got through. I guess the big question now is if Russia was saving up some of an inventory, how often they can repeat this. And so it seems like this contest of will with regard to infrastructure has begun. The third item in the nest speaks to a strike that occurred against a Ukrainian MiG. And this is interesting for a few points that I want to raise in the subsequent tweets. The first of which is that this airfield, I think, was 65 or 70 kilometers away from the front line, which is considerably further than Lancets had been deployed in the past. And so it's not clear if it's just a different tactic or whether they're, adapting different versions of the Lancet. Perhaps they were able to send it at a longer distance because they had better information on a particular target set. So, they were very confident they could send it on a direct one-way trip. So we'll just have to see, about that. But if you look at the fourth item in the nest, there was a tweet that went out today where apparently this airbase was included in a video. It was included in a video that came out about a year ago, and people who had been aware of that were sort of keeping it quiet. They weren't highlighting it. But now that it seems like the Russians are aware of some aspects of it, and they likely, discovered it through these methods, they're highlighting, hey, you must be careful with your leaks because they can be used for targeting purposes. And I think that's just an important point to remind you of. That's the only reason I included this. The one other point I wanted to make based on that attack on the Ukrainian airfield is in the fifth item in the nest. It's a tweet from Tatarigami, where he says, look, I can't demand it, but I do request of my fellow OSINT analysts that you not do battle damage assessment for the Russians. Please don't make it easier for them by sharing imagery of, targets that have been struck. And I'm putting that up as a reminder. I try to live by this. I don't tend to share anything of this type. I'm in several groups that do, they look at satellite work. They'll sometimes do battle damage assessment from ground photos. And occasionally in sort of innocuous questions, we'll look at, should we even report on something on the Ukrainian side? And almost universally, the folks I speak to have erred on the side of, there isn't a ton of value added by sharing the information about the Ukrainian side. And so while we may still keep an eye on it to try and get a better understanding of things, it doesn't necessarily advance the public understanding. And so this is the approach we take, and I think it's a reasonable one. So I'd encourage you to just be mindful of those issues as well. Exit, go ahead.
I just think it's worth noting that the opposite can be true as well, that when people put time and effort into locating different Russian assets and putting it out there, you never know who can be paying attention to those things as well. So, doing great work and publicizing it is awesome if you're making sure you're making conscious decisions about where to or what to work on.
Very fair. So in the last block on developments connected with the offensive, then we'll get into some updates on some diplomacy, including, sort of U.S. politics, Polish politics. We'll see how deep we can get into it. But this last item, or last block of material, there was an OSINT investigation released by the New York Times 3 days ago. It's the first item in the nest, and it speaks to a missile strike that occurred in the city of Kostiantynivka. And the New York Times is citing several experts, some of whom remained anonymous, and you can take that as you will, who are saying that this strike may have been an air defense accident. And they cited, several points in their analysis, including they managed to get their hands on some of the debris, the fragments of the warhead, and they measured it and they looked at shape that helps them to pin down what the potential munition was. They also looked at the shape and size of the holes from fragmentation in metal panels and the like. And they also got evidence, testimony from people on the ground talking about how it appears Ukraine did fire an air defense missile in the location that would be consistent with passing over this location. And finally, they had some video where people look up in a particular spot, and there's also a reflection that moves across the video on the shiny rooftops of cars that indicate the direction of travel of the munition, which appears to be from Ukrainian-controlled territory. I'm saying those things as reported as facts. The Ukrainians have responded initially and said, no, it was a Russian attack. It was not a Ukrainian air defense missile. And so I leave it for you to consider. It seems like the New York Times has, focused on the evidence. And we'll sort of see how it shakes out in the end. Interestingly, the second item in the nest, the Russians jumped on this to, criticize the Ukrainians for the accident or the reporting of the accident. And the Russians were citing the New York Times, but I got a good laugh because Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat noted that, hey, Russians, this team that you're citing to, have your laugh is the same team that highlighted the brutality of the Russians at Bucha. And so if you're endorsing their analytical prowess with regard to this air defense accident, it's not a great look because they're also the same group that say you're committing war crimes. So, the irony there is pretty apparent. The third item in the nest, I like to include an overview of sort of the strategic situation. This is an article from the Kyiv Independent as tweeted out by Mick Ryan, who is a retired Australian general. And it highlights that, yes, it may be the Surovkin lines, but these are Gerasimov tactics, which is taking a shot at the fact that Surovkin seemed like he was a more proficient commander and, initiated the process for the defensive lines, but that Gerasimov, having taken over some months ago, doesn't seem as proficient. And so the actual defense of the lines initially conceived of by Surovkin, or, at least attributed to him, doesn't seem to be particularly strong. And so this was an interesting insight sort of in the current status of Ukraine pressing through those defensive lines. The last two in this block, actually both ones I found from Shashank Joshi's account. He is the defense editor at The Economist. The fourth item I thought was interesting because they were interviewing some experts who were talking about how ultimately there is what happens on the battlefield, but what will drive each side to decide how to continue is what their expectations are for their prospects. And I think that just is an important distinction to raise, which is even if it seems evident that the Ukrainians are meeting with, good, consistent success, the Russians may interpret it entirely differently. And it's that interpretation that will drive their decision, to continue or to pull back. And so I just wanted to put that out there as a reminder. The last point, fifth in the nest, is a visualization of the progress that the Ukrainians have made. The reason I've included this is it's from the New York Times visual investigation team. And if you click through into the article and scroll down, you'll see it has a really interesting presentation where as you scroll through the text, the graphic that's embedded behind it sort of transitions through time, showing the Ukrainian progress pressing through the defenses. So I thought it was an innovative style of presentation, even if you think it's maybe a little bit too pessimistic in terms of the write-up. I appreciated it for the graphical elements, and that's why I wanted to share it here, as it might be inspiring to you guys. Okay. I will move on to discussion of some of the diplomatic developments. And so I'm going to start with just some quick updates on what's happened with Zelensky's visit to the United Nations. Then we'll get into some U.S. politics. I suspect that might be kind of a hot button topic, so we'll see if it generates a bit of a debate. I'm just going to put up the UN material as a block rather than breaking the elements out into the nest separately. If you were to look at this tweet, you'll see that the first thread that I've linked there is Zelensky's longer thread highlighting the points that he wanted to speak to in addressing the UN. And there were several takeaways from this that were highlighted. In particular, he talked about the fact that he doesn't think that the UN is fit for its purpose, of defending the peace. And so he was fairly critical of the UN as a whole. And you can see from the second item in this tweet, under the phrase restrictions on veto powers, there's a write-up from the Kiev Independent that's highlighted the argument that Zelensky made that it would be appropriate for the permanent members of the Security Council to have some restrictions on when they're able to exercise their vetoes as an argument for how to make the Security Council more functional and fit for its purpose. So if you want to see his analysis, have a look at that Kiev Independent article. It's also interesting reading it in light of the US's recent openness to the idea of adding several additional members as permanent members to the Security Council. And they seem like two separate paths forward that might not overlap. It might not be very easy to implement both the US suggestion and Zelensky's suggestion. But I would suggest that you read them together. I then included just a couple of highlights of some of his interesting meetings. It looks like Zelensky met with, a good half dozen or dozen world leaders. I wanted to highlight in particular that he met with Netanyahu of Israel. And my understanding is this is the first time that Zelensky has met with a leader of Israel. And people were suggesting it, could be beneficial. Israel has maintained a generally neutral stance and been unwilling to provide Ukraine with weapon systems, although they have provided some sort of drone monitoring early warning. Just below that in the thread was this is anecdotal, but it's the sort of insight where I think, oh, maybe that's interesting. There was some video of Zelensky meeting during that Israeli meeting with the head of the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. And the Israeli journalist who covered this, Barak Ravid, noted that it looked like they had quite a warm, greeting of one another. And he thinks that could suggest that they have met before and they're already familiar with one another. Again, speculative, but it's the sort of insight where I think, oh, that would have escaped me if it weren't for somebody paying close attention and raising it. You'll also see in that tweet that Zelensky met with President Lula da Silva of Brazil. And several people looked at it and said they didn't seem particularly happy in one another's presence, but Zelensky was very game in saying, Ukraine will work diligently to coordinate with Brazil in order to try to, together work toward the implementation of the Ukrainian peace plan. Finally, in that tweet is a link to the Financial Times article, which covers Biden's address to the United Nations, where he, very clearly called out Russia for its responsibility and essentially urged world leaders to stop Ukraine from being carved up by the Russians. And so it seemed like a fairly full-throated defense rhetorically. But we'll see in a moment that the internal workings of U.S. politics at the moment aren't as clear in their direction of support. Gurney, please go ahead.
Hey, good evening. I was just going to comment here about the last country you mentioned. It's funny that on paper there's very little quantitative and or qualitative support, however, delivered to Ukraine. But the one thing I do notice is when that name is invoked, there's very much quite a bit said, whether it's PR, whether it's spin, whether it's true, whether it's real, much ado about nothing or not. Anyways, my opinion is my insight and opinion is much more is said than anything actually verifiable. And I find that interesting to note whenever, someone batted an eyelash and looked coy, that makes airtime as opposed to any deliveries. I find that interesting when that type of PR is greater than the other. So that's my comment. Thanks.
Yeah, I hear that. I know it's speculative, which is why when I bring it up, I try to flag that when that's the case. Meaning we can't read very much into it, except that potentially it gives some hope that there are additional conversations going on between Ukraine and Israel behind the scenes. But again, we can't confirm that. Okay. So as we move into a discussion of the U.S. political implications, I'll remind you that normally we try to avoid political debate in the space, except as it relates, fairly directly to policy for support for Ukraine. And it just happens that in the last few days, that's become a square issue. So if you'd like to contribute to the conversation, would love you to. We're going to try to avoid getting into too much partisan discussion on it. There are lots of spaces that you can go and have that discussion in. And so the first item that's up is that 2 days ago, in an attempt to pass the Pentagon spending bill, and so my understanding is that the bills necessary as supplemental spending have been broken up based on sort of topic area, and that the Pentagon spending bill was the first that was put forward, and it was defeated by a vote of 214 to 212. And apparently there were 5 members of the Republican Party who voted against it, which led to its defeat. And so that this has now led to, increased political pressure. The Pentagon spending bill, it matters in U.S. domestic politics for a number of reasons that, include if they come to an impasse, then it could lead to a shutdown of the government. These funding bills need to be passed in general, which is simplifying the matter a little bit. the reason it's relevant to us is that some of the new funding for aid to Ukraine is wrapped up in this spending bill. And that's led to some, rapid negotiation. And there are some reports. I appreciate these might overstate the degree of risk, but I think it's at least worth entertaining the risk, so we know sort of what worst case scenario is and what efforts there are to head that off. You'll see that the second item back in the nest is from the tweet from Jake Sherman, who is a political reporter for Punchbowl News, which is sort of a smaller outlet. He is reporting that there apparently is word that House Republicans might work to remove Ukraine-related funding from the spending bill in order to get the remaining items passed more quickly. Again, this is speculation. So when we get into politics, we get into, reports about what people are debating. The third item in the nest is a tweet from Josh Rogan, who is a journalist for the Washington Post. And he's linked to their article where they say that Ukraine aid is hanging by a thread. And I think this is partly a combination of there is urgency in moving the spending bills forward. And if it's viewed as a particularly contentious issue, it may be set aside in order to move the other items forward. That doesn't mean it begs several questions, including if set aside, does that hurt the prospects of additional Ukrainian aid being approved if it's considered as a separate matter? And that's, a question that's a political debate. I'm happy to hear people's opinions on that. It's also not entirely clear that it will be set aside. It may be that some other political solution is found that will allow the bill as currently composed to be passed. Hopefully this isn't all irrelevant and it hasn't been resolved in the last few hours, but this is, as I understand, the state of affairs. As a final point in this block, the fourth item in the nest is an article from Politico that has some additional details about if a shutdown were to occur, it would also threaten Ukrainian training and weapons deliveries. Now, if you bear with me, I think just before the space, I saw a tweet. I think it may have been from Colby, but if you bear with me, I think there was a last-minute deal that was worked out. I think he retweeted it. So anyway, I'm putting it in the nest now. I haven't had time to fully process this, but it should show up as the first item. It's a tweet from Laura Seligman, who is a journalist with Politico, and she said that the Pentagon has now decided to exempt Ukraine operations from a potential shutdown if the lawmakers can't agree on a deal by the end of the month, meaning that certain key training and other activities in support of Ukraine would move ahead uninterrupted. So it seems like they've already anticipated sort of the worst case scenario and they've taken some steps to mitigate it, which doesn't mean, it moves it back to the best case scenario. It just means they're mitigating the worst. Colby, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, that about covers it. Basically, in the event of a government shutdown, training operations that are taking place, such as the F-16 training, which is going to be happening this fall, and the operations for delivering equipment, U.S. Transcom operations, those will all remain active in the event of a government shutdown. When those happens, the Department of Defense doesn't stop operating, but certain functions do that are deemed non-essential. So basically, the Pentagon's making a policy determination that they're going to consider these activities as it relates to Ukraine as essential operations.
So do you have any basis to offer an opinion on whether the Pentagon spending bill will be passed as is, or do you think that Ukraine aid might be taken out and then would have to be considered separately?
Yes, a couple things here. So if you look at Jake's tweet, I actually put a reply in noting that within the Pentagon bill, the Department of Defense Appropriations bill, there was only $300 million in Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative funding in the Pentagon bill. And that's the totality of what President Biden requested within the Department of Defense budget when he submitted his request back in February, because the administration has continued to submit their main requests for Ukraine funding through supplemental appropriations bills rather than making a request as part of the regular appropriations process. So there's not much money to begin with to remove potentially from the Pentagon appropriations. Whether that will pass or not, I don't know. The situation is extremely fluid right now. Anybody who's telling you they know how this is going to end up is wrong. It's very uncertain right now how it's going to play out. As for what's going to happen with the continuing resolution and the supplemental budget request, which contains the majority of the requested aid for Ukraine, again, it's very unclear right now because they weren't able to pass that out of the House either. The Senate is working on their own version. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. Time is very much running out right now because it has to be passed by the end of the month. Otherwise, they do have a shutdown. So if I had to place a bet, I would say that a shutdown is looking more likely than not right now, but we'll have to see. They have a little bit of time left, but not much.
So when our local sort of congressional procedural expert says it's very fluid, you know that it could go any way. So we'll just have to pay close attention. Of course, we'll cover it when we speak next. There was a little bit of progress on other fronts, even if not as much as most of us would like. So you'll see from the first item in the nest, that links to just Reuters coverage of the fact that the U.S. announced a $325 million presidential drawdown. I think shortly before the space, Colby and others tweeted out what was included in that drawdown. I'll try and grab that in a second and put it in the nest, or if anybody else has it, please feel free. And it sounded like there were, $325 million of aid is great in many ways. I think it didn't include some of the items that people had been hoping for. In particular, it sounds like there has not been considerable progress on a decision about providing ATACMS to Ukraine. And by the way, thanks to Colby for including the details on the drawdown. It's now the first item. So if you have a look at the third tweet in the nest from Jackie Heinrich, who works with Fox News, you'll see she has spoken with officials who have been saying that the U.S. was more actively considering ATACMS recently, but at the moment the focus is on helping Ukrainian forces to push through Russian minefields, and they feel that there's a more time-sensitive nature to assisting Ukraine in that way. So I think maybe the suggestion is, first of all, we don't want to deal with it right now. Secondly, perhaps to the extent we are going to deal with it, it might still be of great use to the Ukrainians when their mobility has been reduced. Whereas if we get them things they can use immediately, that should be the focus. That might be a political cop-out. But anyway, that's where it stands. It looks like ATACMS is not arriving anytime soon. And this seems, consistent. We had reports about a week ago that it was not anticipated there would be any announcement during Zelensky's visit. The fifth in the nest is an argument that was put forward by the Washington Post. I believe it was their editorial board who came out and said that the White House should provide ATACMS to Ukraine. So it's interesting that they're weighing in at the editorial board level in such an obvious way. So yeah, again, you can see that the article was passed along by John Cipher. So there's, political pressure is continuing to build, even though we're not, even though it sounds like it's not imminent that a decision will be made. to that end, there have been some great threads on ATACMS with details so you can understand both technical aspects, political aspects, why Ukraine is interested in them. And so those two threads are in the nest as the 6th and 7th items. The first of which is a thread by Dylan Payton. It's a good thread. It provides some good details. It is only 28 tweets long, which we don't normally use tweet length as our primary measure, but when you compare it with the next item back, which is Colby's thread that was long awaited on ATACMS, it was a monster. I think it was like 72 tweets, and got a ton of attention as great analysis. It includes historical and technical details up front if you're not familiar with them, and then makes the political arguments as to why it makes sense tactically and politically for the United States toward the end of the thread. Lots and lots of sort of mainstream reporters were retweeting Colby's thread. So I suspect you've probably already seen it, but if you haven't, go and check it out, as I think it is sort of the comprehensive statement on the matter. As a final point on sort of the U.S. finance issues, it's back a ways. I think it's the 8th or 9th item because we've put a few up in the front now. But once again, Colby has been paying particularly close attention to this, and he has tweeted about the fact that there are about $5 billion in presidential drawdown authority remaining. It's about $5 billion now after the 325 announced today. And last year, Congress specifically, explicitly, renewed the amounts. Interestingly, Colby has shared details here where the approach that's been taken is that congressional notifications have been provided that they believe will provide legal authority for the drawdown to persist across fiscal years. And, in Colby's opinion, he's saying he thinks this might be a dicey interpretation. I'm curious, Colby, since you're with us, do you have any insight why they would pursue this approach rather than explicitly reauthorize it? Would you think it may have been in anticipation of this resistance we're now seeing associated with the Pentagon spending bill?
I don't know. I mean, the main thing here is that if they were to just announce a drawdown with the total sum that's remaining this year, that would put them on very, very firm legal ground to execute the drawdowns up to that value for as long as they need to, because a drawdown, once it's announced, there's no time limit on how long it takes you to actually execute the deliveries. That can happen indefinitely, I suppose, theoretically. Practically speaking, it wouldn't, but I'm not aware of any statutory requirement for the execution to be complete on any sort of timeline. The challenge here is that because they went through this re-evaluation process due to the mistake that they were making, it's their position that because essentially they're saying they already announced the total value of authority that's been given by Congress. So because it's already been announced, then now they are free to execute those drawdowns because it was already announced and Congress was already informed of the drawdown. Which, this all sounds very technical, but the details matter when we're talking about the law. And it's a very minor, simple thing for them to just make a new announcement saying, yeah, we're announcing $5 billion, however much that's going to be drawn down for Ukraine. They send a notification to Congress as they're required to do so, and then they can execute the drawdown going forward. But they're not opting for that. They're just opting for the strategy of saying, no, we've already given Congress the notifications that we're required to by law, and we're going to continue to execute these drawdowns going forward. And that's just a little bit riskier. In my view, Congress could be unhappy with that. The Department of Defense Inspector General, who is investigating this matter, could be unhappy with that. And they're just opening themselves up for trouble in the approach that they're taking here. And I don't understand why they would want to assume that level of risk, especially given that it's very uncertain whether they're going to get any new aid passed through Congress. This is basically all they have to work with. So taking this very risky approach seems very foolish to me.
So this may be, the seed that is sowing future analysis if there's additional political drama. So it's, sort of a flag of, boy, we need to pay attention to this because this might lead to some future fights.
And I'll just say thank you to Bryant Harris at Defense News, who wrote this piece. I brought this to his attention because he wrote the article about the expiration last year, and he actually went and got the answer from the Pentagon. So thank you to him for taking the initiative on that and getting us clarity on it.
Yeah, you noted that somebody finally asked the question in the right way, which is, a critical thing, because it sounded like several people had sort of raised it without getting a clear answer. So it is great that worked out. We're being joined by another speaker. We'll take questions there in a moment. Just while he's joining, I'll point out two last political items. They're the first and second items in the nest at the moment. I'm just reporting the facts as they're being passed along. You can infer whatever political implications you like. That first item in the nest, again, coming from Punchbowl News, are apparently Zelensky offered to speak to a joint address of Congress. And apparently the House of Representatives refused that request, which is why Zelensky spoke to the Senate, but not to a joint session. And apparently they were also offered the opportunity to receive the same classified briefing on Ukraine that the Senate received and refused that. So, take that as you will for its political implications. The second item in the nest was a development. There are many people who, continue to support Ukraine, even among the, the Republican Party. And you can see in that second item that, Senator Wicker has come out and called on the administration not only to provide Ukraine with ATACMS, but also to increase the industrial production of precision strike missiles, and that only through sufficient military capacity will the war come to a conclusion. So, that's close to calling for delivery of precision strike missiles to Ukraine, and it's good to have advocates on Ukraine's behalf, even when they're facing these headwinds in other areas. We'll go to Gurney, who came up first, then we'll go to Colby. Go ahead, Gurney.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Listening to Colby, I appreciated Colby's thread there the other day with the ATACMS, that very in-depth thread. I very much appreciated a lot of the slide deck and a lot of the historical reporting that he sourced together. I'm sure that was some tremendous work, and so I really appreciate that. My larger point here, and maybe I mentioned this 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, we can be right on the details, but when something becomes a political football, right, when we can be right on the details of asking for things, we can be right on the details for asking for deficiencies, we can be right on pointing things out and corrections. But there's a larger narrative out there much beyond us. There's people looking for excuses. There's people looking for ways out. There's a lot of things happening. And when something becomes a political football or politicized, and again, I acknowledge all things are political, but when we allow something to become politicized and we attribute success or failure to that, sidestepping the political aspect of it is, look, we have to be smarter strategically to think about, especially the people in this room, if we want to support Ukraine, how to best do that. And I say this, the attack comes for Ukraine, great. The presidential drawdown authority, great on the details. But what we're sort of staring at currently, and again, it is probably going to be resolved, or hopefully going to be resolved, we're talking about $5 billion of PDA in the details, and we can be right on that. However, we can lose the bigger picture and lose the larger narrative. So when we say we don't want to displease Congress, or we want to spend this $5 billion, but the reality is right now we're looking at currently not yet a reauthorization of support for Ukraine, and possibly, no actual spending, no allocation for that for U.S. For U.S. regular operations. We know there's contingency operations, but it has an effect. And so what I say by this is, if we focus too much on the details of being right, perhaps we lose the larger narrative message that we need to hold. And we can think about alternate solutions to both be right and figure out ways to advocate for Ukraine and advocate for support, so that we don't give fuel to any politicization of the Ukrainian issue. Because when we open the door to say someone's right, someone's wrong, X, Y, or Z, we can do more, we can do less, whatever that is, there's always other parties looking to capitalize on that as sort of oppositional. And I don't think we should give excuses out there, because currently, if you look, give a mouse a cookie, what do they want? So we've been talking about ATACMS, we've been talking about other things. It's not solely ATACMS. And this comment is not attributed to Colby. But when we are right on the details, but those details become threads that are pulled out by others much further outside of these spaces, they get parlayed from one issue that is significant and important for Ukraine, but they get parlayed and magnified into larger issues. So right now, whether we're talking about ATACMS or $5 billion, currently, we're not looking at a $24 billion reauthorization. Now, that may happen, but what I want to say is let's not get lost too far in the details. We do need to discuss them, but we do need to find better strategies in terms of solutions for those details, not the details themselves. The conversation and the open sourcing and the reporting is great. I think it comes down to what is the messaging on the solutions? And that's my comment. Again, because it may not seem obvious, or to others it may seem obvious, but for me, this is sort of like this is potentially part of our own doing, where we create or add fuel to a fire that others use in a much different way than discussions that happen in these spaces and other places. So that's my comment, just in terms of that. Is it always worth it to look and be right on every single detail, but get completely lost such that, now the authorization itself is completely up in the air? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I know there are some among us who are quite good at their efforts to lobby politicians. Again, I'm not an American, so I would have my own efforts here. But what I would say that not being too caught up in the details is a fair point. There have been some interesting comments in the last few days. There was one by Andrew Mishta. I'll see if I can find it. And Gary Kasparov often writes about this as well, is the idea of leadership and sort of a theory of victory. And so if I'm following you, I think maybe what you're advocating for is, aside from getting too caught up in the details, is the idea of sort of changing the discussion in a way that focuses on what's more significant in the long run. And I would suggest those folks talking about leadership are probably heading in the right direction. And I guess then the question is, how can those of us who would like a particular outcome influence U.S. leadership sort of at the highest levels? And, short of sort of the same approaches of contacting your your reps and make your message heard. Maybe what I'll say is it's above my pay grade about how do you influence, White House policy. But I hear you on being focused on, political success and not too worried about procedural detail. Although I love detail. Go ahead, Colby.
Thanks. So coming back to Senator Wicker's remarks, I strongly appreciate his continued advocacy on this topic, but specifically around precision strike missile and his suggestion that there needs to be an additional supplemental from the administration, a supplemental request to fund additional production for precision strike missile. If you refer to my graphs in my thread about this topic, you'll see that the DoD has already signed 2 contracts for PRSM. They are forecasting, significant additional yearly buys of precision strike missile. The Army acquisition objective just for increment 1 alone is 4,000 missiles. So I don't think that this is a money problem where if the administration, if the DoD was to spend more money on precision strike missile production could be increased. I don't believe that's the case. I don't think Lockheed needs more money. I think that the constraints around PRSM production are other and have something to do actually with the fact that there's still very significant demand for ATACMS that has to be fulfilled. So I'm not sure that could be achieved with more funding, but I suppose we'll have more clarity on this in the spring when we get the new procurement data out when the new budget request comes.
Well, thanks for that. I guess I was behind on the precision strike missile debate, so thanks for bringing me up to speed. Okay. We are normally I aim to run 3 hours and then normally run about 3.5. So I'll work toward wrapping fairly soon. Because there was so much news in terms of diplomatic developments and the like, we didn't get too much into discussion of Ukrainian equipment, Russian equipment. We also didn't get to any of the little blocks I put together on the brief fight between the Azerbaijani military and the residents of Nagorno-Karabakh, and it's because it had implications for Russian foreign policy as well. I'm mentioning those things to say, again, if you click on, the invitation to the space or any of the others, you can see the thread and go and look it up for yourself. So there might be some detail in there that you had missed. Just before we get in, I've selected 2 or 3 last points I want to make as particularly interesting in the last couple of days. Just before we get into those last points, I'll just remind you that our next conversation will be on Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. The invitation is the first item in the nest, so you can set your reminder now. And I think we are hoping to have some old friends of ours drop by just for some casual chats. So that might give you a hint at who will have come and chat with us. The last items I want to highlight, there are 2 from the Black Sea, and then there's the political fallout of the positions being taken by Poland that I just wanted to address briefly. And so the 2 most interesting items from the Black Sea were a ship that was flying under the flag of Togo, the SEMA, struck a mine and was significantly damaged. I understand the crew evacuated. I believe they were all safely evacuated, which is good news. I haven't heard any details in terms of what kind of a mine it was. Is this an area that's regularly trafficked? I don't have insight into those things. It looks like Exit might in a moment. But there have been several mines that have drifted ashore and had to be demined recently. Interestingly, Romania, Ukraine, the United States, and others held in a military exercise that included a significant demining component. So clearly it's an ongoing danger. And because I know Exit will speak to this next point as well, I'll just get it in so she can address both. The third item in the nest was the big update from the last few days that some ships are now traveling into the Ukrainian ports to pick up Ukrainian grain, the main deep water ports, Odessa and the like, and are exiting. And the first of those ships has now exited the Black Sea through the Turkish Straits, which is great news. This is not a resumption of the Black Sea Grain Initiative with Turkey and Russia being involved. This is just ships who are willing to move through a corridor indicated by Ukraine, and apparently there haven't been any actions to interdict them. And it's hoped that we'll see a few more ships. The progress of resuming may be slow, but I hear that it's promising. So Exit, go ahead.
I choked on water just as you said that, sorry. So to my knowledge, and please correct me if somebody knows different, there is no confirmation that the SEMA was actually hit by a mine. There was confirmation that there was an explosion. It was near the engine room, but I have not specifically heard that there was confirmation that it actually was hit by a mine. Nukes, I saw your hand go up there. Did you have something to add?
Hitting all the wrong buttons. No, I don't have anything major to add. I was just agreeing with you. I haven't heard any other confirmations either, other than the explosion.
Yeah, so I just would caution, wait for more news. If anybody sees it, please send it along. I do not necessarily believe that it was a mine, only because we don't know. So that would be the first piece of information. The Resilient Africa is the name of the very, very tiny ship that left the port of Chernомorsk. It just in the last hour transited the Bosphorus Strait and is now in the Mara Sea out on the other side of Istanbul, which is very exciting because if you know anything about me, you know that I probably did a very happy dance when that actually happened because I have a ship to track and it's exciting. It's exciting because it's actually a successful trip. We needed to see at least one successful trip before a lot of other pieces could start to fall into place. I talked about that on Sunday as well. I had some confirmation today that there's been at least a little bit of movement on some insurance offerings and other pieces of information that lead me to believe there will be other trips planned in the not too distant future. So it's exciting that Ukraine is finally looking like they're getting some traction with their corridor, and hopefully that will continue. We did see a missile strike in Odessa earlier this afternoon. But it wasn't entirely, or at least I haven't seen, because I was also getting ready for the space, I haven't seen specifically targeting information of exactly where that missile strike went. So if anybody sees that, by all means, you can send that along too. That would be great. I think that's all the updates I have for that one.
Okay, well, thank you. There were some other Black Sea updates. There was footage released of apparent USV attacks on the Sergei Kotov, which was claimed to have been damaged. There were updates on the battle damage assessment to the Russian submarine. We got better pictures. We don't have time to get into all of those. We'll save those and consolidate them, and then we'll speak a little bit more at length about Black Sea matters on Sunday. The last item I wanted to point to, just because it seemed like it was, you guys know the meme, well, that escalated quickly, is the political developments between Ukraine and Poland, where Poland for some, I think now months, had been imposing some restrictions on the export of Ukrainian agricultural products. That was temporarily enforced with some EU coordination across 5 countries. The EU implemented version ended just in the last few days. Of the 5 countries, 2 pretty quickly said that they were going to drop their objection and or negotiate slightly different terms with Ukraine. And so Romania and Bulgaria either dropped or negotiated. Recently, I think Slovakia said they were going to work out a licensing program and drop the general prohibitions as well. However, Poland started to double down, but it escalated from that. And so if you look in the nest at the 4th item, I've just put it up as a block, but the claim that came out was that the Polish prime minister, in an interview on local Polish news, had said, we're not going to provide weapons to Ukraine anymore. And that was taken out of context, and it was the highlight. So if you look at the material I pulled together, the first tweet links to the news org that interviewed him. If you click through it, there's a write-up, and in the middle of the page is embedded the video of the interview if you want to see the original. I know that I had trouble loading it because of country restrictions, but if you use a VPN, it does load. And if you have a look at the second item in the nest, you'll see this is from Daniel Ziligowski, who's saying, look, we're not transferring weapons to Ukraine is not correct. Essentially what he's saying is that, we've reached a point where we're purchasing modern weapons, and the old weapons that of the type that we were delivering to Ukraine have already been committed. And as a result of that, we're not providing weapons to Ukraine. However, there are a couple of nuances on that. One is you can see from the Kiev Independent article here that it was reported, apparently that statement, that position was not discussed in advance with the Polish Foreign Ministry, and that in the 4th item in the tweet where it says weapons are still being delivered, there was a clarification that was put out in reporting from Bloomberg where they said that, in fact, we will continue to deliver weapons to Ukraine. Those weapons that we have previously promised, we still intend to deliver. So they're narrowing it down to essentially the prime minister saying, we may not make new commitments, and the reason we are not making new commitments is because the type of weapons that are most eligible to send have already been sent. Now, some people have quibbled with that, saying that the Polish still have more options they could commit. But anyway, I think it's making clear that the interpretation of we are so upset over the grain matter that we're just not going to support Ukraine is not what was intended, and that there seems to be a little bit of walk back. A little bit more detail, though, from the 5th item in the nest. These are the last points I'm going to get to. You can see that in that first tweet where I've used the phrase tying grain and weapons, that's the point made by Shashank Joshi of The Economist, saying, well, look, even if you're not saying we're withdrawing support from Ukraine, there was really very little need to even bring up weapons in the context of this grain disagreement. And it seems like they may have been connected in a way intended to get leverage over Ukraine in that debate. With, even if they're not going to cut their support, it doesn't look very good politically, or diplomatically, from an outsider's perspective. And I think that's a fair point. And then the second item there, you can see under the phrase impact of elections, Exit put out a tweet where she linked to the ongoing live set of polls in the Polish election, which is due to be held on October the 15th. And that's sort of the underlying note here, is that it's posturing in advance of the election that appears to be making them take a hard line. And unfortunately, it seems like the story's not over, as Ukraine and Poland are still sort of, trading barbs back and forth with regard to trade, whereby Poland had speculated that they might, in fact, broaden the bans even further, and that Ukraine has responded in kind by imposing embargoes on onions, tomatoes, cabbages, and other agricultural products from Poland. sort of escalating the trade war just to say, like, look, we can expand this if you want to. And I think they've also made an application for a case before the World Trade Organization. So we'll see how the grain matter works out. I just wanted to highlight that there were breathless headlines that went around for about a day suggesting that that Poland was taking this as a matter of that was so serious that it would be significantly undercutting their support for Ukraine. But it seems like it's largely posturing in advance of the election, and perhaps unwise and not approved by the foreign ministry. But hopefully it doesn't do too much damage, as they have been, terrific allies. And I think as nations have grown together in the last year and a half. Okay, with that, I think I will wrap up. So I'll say thank you to everybody who came to join us. I'm glad you stuck with us. I would like to thank the speakers that we had tonight, in particular our special guests, Luis, El Huaso, and All Source News. I thought it was a really interesting chat about their work investigating cartel activity in Mexico. I think it highlights another community that exists here on Twitter that we don't get a lot of insight into, and we want to highlight more regularly. Hopefully we'll have them back to discuss their projects in the future. I'd encourage you to check out their accounts and the accounts of all the speakers we've had up tonight, as they've been putting in a ton of work. And many of our speakers have been following the war in detail since the beginning. Finally, I'd like to say thank you to my co-hosts, to All Source News, to Exit, and to Radio Nukes, who filled in at the end here. Without your guys' help, it would be extremely hard to run these spaces. And so I hope that you can join us on Sunday afternoon at 4 for our next conversation. And until then, have a good night.